My name is Harper. I am 31 years old and I am a forensic accountant. Last Tuesday night, my identical twin sister showed up at my apartment door, shaking and covered in dark purple bruises. So, I made a choice that would alter the course of our lives forever. I took her place. Her arrogant husband never realized I was not the woman he had been hurting until he made a fatal mistake that cost him everything. Before I reveal how I dismantled his life piece by piece, tell me where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you believe abusers should always get what they deserve. The rain in Seattle washed down my windows in sheets of gray. I had just finished a grueling 70-hour work week untangling corporate fraud when the frantic knocking started. A desperate and heavy pounding rattled my front door. I pulled it open. Haley stood there, soaking wet and trembling. My lungs forgot how to pull in air. My beautiful, identical twin sister looked like she had barely survived a terrible car crash. Her left eye was swollen shut beneath black and purple skin. She cradled her fractured right wrist against her chest. Blood mingled with rainwater dripping from her chin. I pulled her inside and locked the deadbolt. She collapsed into my arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Between gasping breaths, she choked out words that made my blood run cold. Derek told her if she did not sign over the deed to the lakefront property we inherited from our grandmother by tomorrow morning, he was going to kill her. That property was the only thing our grandmother left us. It was a secluded cabin where Haley and I spent our childhood summers. When Haley refused his demands, his anger turned to violence. He promised no one would ever find her body in the Puget Sound. He was entirely serious. I did not waste time offering hollow comforts. My sister was fighting for her life and tears were not going to save her. I guided Haley to my guest bedroom and wrapped her in my thickest blankets. I handed her a bottle of water and my burner phone, instructing her to keep the doors locked and not answer for anyone. Then I walked into my bathroom and stared at my reflection in the harsh fluorescent light. Haley and I shared the exact same bone structure, the same hazel eyes, and the same height. But my hair fell past my shoulders in soft waves, while Haley kept hers in a sharp, angled bob. I reached into my drawer and pulled out my heavy fabric scissors. Without a single second of hesitation, I grabbed a fistful of my own hair and began to cut. The wet blonde strands fell into the porcelain sink in thick, heavy clumps. I kept cutting until my hair mirrored my sister's exact style. Next came the makeup. I opened my professional theater palette, a leftover from my college drama days. Using a dense sponge, I carefully applied deep violet and sickly yellow tones around my left eye, blending the colors outward until it perfectly matched the brutal contusion Derek had given my sister. I added a touch of pale foundation to my lips to mimic her exhausted and terrified pallor. I slipped into a beige cashmere sweater and dark leggings, a classic Haley outfit I had borrowed months ago. I looked like a victim, but underneath the expensive wool and the painted bruises, my heart was beating with a cold and calculated fury. I grabbed my leather work briefcase and walked out into the freezing rain. The drive to Derek's sprawling smart home in the affluent suburbs of Bellevue took exactly 42 minutes. The heavy rain pounded against my windshield, rhythmically mirroring the relentless pounding of my own pulse. The entire way, my mind raced through the financial data I already knew about my brother-in-law. He ran a lucrative real estate firm, but I always suspected his ledgers were cooked. He drove luxury sports cars, wore custom Italian suits, and constantly bragged about his stock portfolio at family gatherings. Yet his actual business filings never seemed to reflect that massive level of liquid wealth. I knew he was hiding something dark, and I was finally going to find out exactly what it was. I pulled my sedan down the street, parking 2 blocks away under the heavy shadow of an old oak tree, so he would not recognize my vehicle. The storm provided the perfect cover as I walked up his long manicured driveway. Derek prided himself on his impenetrable home security. His front door was equipped with a state-of-the-art biometric fingerprint scanner and a reinforced deadbolt tied to an encrypted network. Haley had told me he frequently locked her out in the cold if she displeased him, forcing her to beg to be let back in. But Derek was arrogant, and arrogance always leaves a digital footprint. I am a forensic accountant who specializes in cyber fraud. I do not just read spreadsheets, I dismantle secure systems to find where the money hides. Earlier in my car, I had pulled up the frequency data I previously skimmed from Derek's home network during a Thanksgiving dinner. Using a blank radio frequency identification tag and a portable writer kept in my briefcase, I cloned the encrypted handshake his smart lock used to communicate with his primary server. I stood on his front porch, shivering in the biting wind. I pressed the small black plastic tag against the hidden sensor beneath the keypad. The heavy metal mechanism clicked over with a soft mechanical whir. The door unlocked instantly. I took a deep breath, letting the cold air fill my lungs before pushing the door open. I stepped out of the freezing rain into the dark, silent foyer of the lion's den, ready to face the monster my sister married. The heavy oak door closed behind me with a solid thud, sealing me inside the sprawling multi-million-dollar estate. The foyer was pitch black except for the faint blue glow of the smart home security panels illuminating the imported marble floors. The air in the house felt heavy and suffocating, like a vacuum designed to pull the life out of anyone who entered. I slipped my wet shoes off, placing them neatly by the door, exactly the way my sister Haley always did. I took a slow, quiet breath, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. A faint amber light spilled from the massive open-concept kitchen at the end of the long hallway. I could hear the clinking of ice against crystal. Derek was waiting. My heart pounded against my ribs, but I forced my breathing to slow down. I walked down the corridor, keeping my footsteps feather-light. As I rounded the corner into the kitchen, the smell of expensive single malt scotch and stale arrogance hit me instantly. Derek was leaning against the center island dressed in custom-tailored slacks and a pristine white dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar. He looked exactly like the wealthy, successful real estate mogul he portrayed to the world. A handsome, charming man who commanded respect in boardrooms and at charity galas. But I knew the truth. I saw the monster hiding behind his perfectly groomed exterior. He took a slow sip from his heavy crystal glass, his dark eyes locking onto me with cold, terrifying calculation. He did not ask where I had been. He did not ask if I was okay. He simply set his glass down on the granite countertop with a sharp crack that echoed through the silent house. "You are late," he said, his voice dangerously low and smooth. The sheer entitlement in his tone made my blood boil. He took a slow, deliberate step toward me. His towering frame was designed to intimidate, to make a woman feel small and helpless. I kept my head slightly bowed, letting my wet hair fall forward to shadow my face, playing the role of the broken wife he thought he had created. I needed him to believe I was completely defeated. He closed the distance between us in 3 long strides. Before I could even blink, his large hand shot out and clamped down hard on my right wrist. His grip was like a steel vise digging painfully into my skin, exactly where he had fractured my sister's bone just hours earlier. "Look at me when I am talking to you," he hissed, leaning his face so close to mine I could smell the sharp alcohol on his breath. He expected me to flinch. He expected me to cry and beg for his forgiveness, just like he had conditioned Haley to do for the past 5 years. He squeezed my wrist tighter, intending to cause excruciating pain to assert his absolute dominance over my body and my mind. But he made a massive miscalculation. He was not holding the wrist of a terrified and broken woman. He was holding the wrist of a woman who had spent the last 7 years training intensively in Krav Maga. My job as a forensic accountant often required me to audit dangerous shell companies connected to organized crime rings. After a particularly close call early in my career, where a desperate executive tried to corner me in a dark parking garage, I swore I would never allow myself to be physically vulnerable to any man ever again. I spent thousands of hours on the mats, learning how to dismantle larger and stronger opponents. My muscle memory reacted faster than conscious thought. I did not scream. I did not pull away. Instead, I stepped directly into his personal space, using my momentum against his towering height. I twisted my trapped arm sharply inward, breaking his grip instantly with a brutal snap of leverage. Before his alcohol-soaked brain could even process that he had lost control, I pivoted my hips and drove the heel of my palm directly upward into the sensitive nerve cluster beneath his tricep. A sharp gasp of shock erupted from his lungs as his arm went entirely numb. I did not stop there. The profound anger over what he had done to my sister fueled every single physical movement. I grabbed his collar with my free hand, hooked my right leg behind his knee, and swept his feet out from under him with devastating force. Derek crashed down onto the hard ceramic kitchen floor with a sickening thud. The breath was knocked out of him completely. I followed him down, driving my knee sharply into his chest, pinning him flat against the cold tiles. I grabbed his wrist, the exact same wrist he had just used to grab me, and twisted it backward into a painful and inescapable joint lock. The crystal Scotch glass he had left on the counter vibrated from the sheer impact of his heavy body hitting the floorboards. For 3 agonizing seconds, there was absolute dead silence in the massive kitchen. Derek lay pinned beneath me, his chest heaving wildly as his brain desperately tried to understand what had just happened. The arrogant, powerful man who ruled his household through fear and violence was now completely immobilized by the woman he thought he had destroyed. His dark eyes widened in absolute shock and pure, unfiltered panic. I leaned down, bringing my face inches from his. I let him see the cold, burning fury in my eyes. The painted bruises on my face stood in stark contrast to the terrifying calmness of my expression. I applied just a fraction of an inch more pressure to his trapped arm, and he let out a pathetic, whimpering groan that sounded exactly like a wounded animal. "This is the part where you stay completely still," I whispered, my voice steady and completely devoid of any emotion. I held him there, letting the absolute humiliation of his defeat wash over him. I wanted him to feel the exact same helplessness he had forced upon my sister. I wanted the cold, hard reality of his own physical weakness to burn itself permanently into his massive, fragile ego. Slowly and deliberately, I released his arm and stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from my beige cashmere sweater. I stepped back and looked down at him with utter and complete disgust. Derek scrambled backward across the kitchen floor, his expensive slacks sliding against the sleek tile until his back hit the stainless steel refrigerator. He clutched his aching arm, his chest heaving as he stared up at me, like I was an absolute stranger. His profound shock rapidly morphed into a dark and violent rage. The extreme humiliation of being so easily overpowered by his submissive wife in his own kitchen shattered his delusional sense of superiority. "You crazy bitch," he spat, his face turning a deep mottled red as the thick veins in his neck bulged. He struggled to his feet, leaning heavily against the island counter for much-needed physical support. He pointed a trembling finger at me, his eyes practically bulging out of his skull with intense fury. "You have completely lost your mind, Haley. You have finally snapped under the pressure of this marriage." I stood my ground, keeping my posture perfectly straight and my breathing perfectly even. I did not give him the satisfaction of a reaction. I simply stared right through him. My chilling silence only infuriated him further. He began pacing back and forth, gripping the heavy granite edges of the island, his knuckles turning bright white. He was frantically trying to regain control of the narrative, to twist his humiliating physical defeat into a psychological victory. "You think you are strong now?" He laughed bitterly, a cruel and calculated sound meant to deeply demean me. "You think a little outburst changes anything in this house? You are nothing without me and my money. You are a weak, pathetic mess, and everyone in our elite social circle knows it." He stopped pacing and leaned across the granite counter, his eyes narrowing into dark, menacing slits. "You have until my family dinner tomorrow night to sign those property deeds over to my firm. If you do not sign them, I will not even bother touching you again. I will call my private physician and I will have you committed to a psychiatric ward on an involuntary hold for violent hysteria. I will tell them you attacked me in a manic paranoid episode. I will tell them you are a severe danger to yourself and to others. With your documented history of anxiety and the fresh bruises you gave yourself falling down the stairs, they will lock you away in a padded room so fast your head will spin." He smiled a sickeningly triumphant smile that made my stomach churn with pure hatred. "I have the money. I have the high-priced lawyers. I have all the power in this city. You will lose absolutely everything, Haley. You will be heavily medicated and locked securely behind steel doors while I take that lakefront property anyway and sell it to the highest bidder. Be a good little wife and sign the papers tomorrow, or I will erase you from society completely." He grabbed the half-empty bottle of scotch, poured himself another generous glass with shaking hands, and walked out of the kitchen without looking back. His heavy, aggressive footsteps echoed up the grand, sweeping staircase, leaving me entirely alone in the oppressive silence of the smart house. He truly thought he had won the war. He thought he had backed me into an inescapable corner, using his immense wealth and social influence as an unbeatable weapon. But he had just given me exactly what I needed to destroy him. He had given me a strict deadline and a perfect stage. Tomorrow night, his entire wealthy, pretentious family would be gathered around the grand dining table. Tomorrow night, I would have a captive audience to witness his downfall. And as a forensic accountant, I knew exactly how to use his own arrogance and his hidden financial secrets to dismantle his entire empire from the inside out. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my encrypted burner phone, and began mapping out the network architecture of his home office. The real fight had just begun. The echo of his heavy footsteps faded into the cavernous upper floor of the house, leaving me entirely alone in the massive open-concept kitchen. The terrifying threat of a psychiatric hold hung heavy in the air, like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I knew exactly how easily a man with Derek's immense wealth and elite social standing could completely manipulate the mental health system. He could hire private, unethical doctors, bribe facility directors, and fabricate a completely convincing history of severe mental instability for my sister. By tomorrow night, Haley would not just be trapped in an abusive marriage, she would be legally erased, stripped of her fundamental human rights, and locked away in a sterile white room where no one could ever hear her scream. I could not wait for the family dinner. I could not wait for daylight. I needed absolute concrete leverage, and I needed it tonight. I stood completely still in the dark kitchen for nearly an hour, listening to the subtle, settling sounds of the sprawling, multi-million-dollar estate. I heard the muffled thud of a heavy solid wood bedroom door closing violently upstairs, followed eventually by the deep, rhythmic snoring that signaled the expensive single malt scotch had finally dragged Derek into a heavy, alcohol-induced sleep. It was time to move. I slipped out of the kitchen, moving silently through the expansive first floor. My bare feet made absolutely no sound against the freezing cold, imported marble tiles. I had mentally mapped the exact layout of the estate from the few agonizingly tense Thanksgiving dinners I had attended here in the years past. Derek's private home office was located at the extreme far end of the West Wing, a room Haley was strictly and aggressively forbidden from ever entering. He always claimed it was due to highly sensitive commercial real estate documents, but a seasoned forensic accountant knows that a locked door in a private residence is never just about protecting client confidentiality. It is always about concealing deeply personal sins. The long hallway leading to the West Wing was pitch black. Derek utilized a highly sophisticated smart home network with integrated motion sensors specifically designed to trigger low-level security lighting if anyone walked through the corridors after midnight. But I knew the architectural blind spots of these expensive automated systems. The sensors were precisely angled to detect adult height movement in the exact center of the walkway. I dropped down to my hands and knees, pressing my body completely flat against the expensive textured silk wallpaper, and crawled slowly along the absolute edge of the wooden baseboards. The thick wool runner rug burned against my bare skin, but I did not stop moving until I reached the heavy, solid mahogany double doors of his private sanctuary. The ornate brass handle was icy cold to the touch. I turned it with agonizing slowness, holding my breath in the silent darkness as the internal metal mechanism clicked. The heavy door swung open on perfectly oiled silent hinges, revealing a massive room that smelled heavily of rich aged leather and expensive stale cigar smoke. I slipped inside and gently closed the door behind me, locking it with a soft, barely audible click. The heavy dark velvet curtains were drawn tight, blocking out the relentless Seattle rain and plunging the room into total suffocating darkness. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my encrypted burner phone, activating a specialized low-light red filter on the screen so I could see without bleeding visible light under the doorframe. The expansive office was a monument to his towering, fragile ego. A massive custom-built solid walnut desk dominated the exact center of the room, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookshelves filled with pristine leather-bound volumes he likely never even opened. I moved directly to the desk. My trained fingers expertly traced the underside of the heavy wood, searching for hidden compartments or secret latches. Nothing. I turned my attention to the walls. Behind a garish abstract painting that completely clashed with the traditional aristocratic decor, I found exactly what I was looking for: a flush-mounted wall safe. But this was not a standard hotel lockbox. It was a high-grade commercial security vault built directly into the reinforced steel frame of the house. I stared at the sleek black glass of the digital keypad. It was a state-of-the-art biometric dual-factor authentication system. It required a physical numerical passcode followed by a retinal scan or a complex secondary master code override. A single incorrect entry would not just lock the vault, it would instantly trigger a silent alarm directly to Derek's private security firm and wake the entire house in a matter of seconds. My heart pounded a frantic, terrified rhythm against my ribs. I had less than 3 minutes before the automated security sweep reset the internal network logs. I pulled my phone back out and opened a custom thermal imaging application I'd specifically installed for high-stakes corporate field audits. The specialized app utilized the infrared camera hardware on my modified device to detect residual heat signatures left behind on physical surfaces. Derek had accessed this safe earlier in the evening, likely to deposit the forged property transfer documents he intended to force Haley to sign tomorrow. The glass keypad would still hold the microscopic thermal footprint of his fingertips. I held my phone up to the dark panel. The screen glowed softly, illuminating 4 distinct heat blooms in bright yellow and deep orange against a dark blue digital background. The numbers 379 and 2. The darkest orange spot was the last button pressed. The lightest yellow was the very first. The chronological sequence was 3972, but that was only the very first layer of security. The secondary prompt blinked menacingly on the small LCD screen, demanding the complex override code. I closed my eyes, taking a deep, steadying breath, and forced my racing mind to filter through every single piece of psychological data I had ever gathered on my arrogant brother-in-law. He was a textbook classic narcissist. Narcissists do not use randomly generated alphanumeric sequences for their master passwords. They use specific dates and numbers that constantly validate their own monumental sense of self-importance. He would not use his wedding anniversary with my sister. He would not use her birthday. I thought back to his most boastful, arrogant speeches at elite family gatherings. The exact date he successfully closed his first multi-million-dollar commercial real estate deal, securing his absolute financial independence from his wealthy, demanding father's shadow. August 14th, 2010. I keyed in 08142010. The heavy internal steel locking bolts retracted with a deep mechanical groan that sounded incredibly loud. In the dead, suffocating silence of the dark room, I let out a shaking breath I did not realize I had been holding. I pulled the heavy, solid steel door open. The deep interior of the vault was stacked with neatly organized manila folders, thick, heavy stacks of $100 bills, tightly bound in bank tape, and a small, unassuming black leather ledger. I completely ignored the stacks of cash. Cash is just a superficial symptom of greed. The ledger is the actual disease. I pulled the black book out and opened it beneath the dim red glow of my phone screen. My eyes rapidly scanned the meticulously handwritten columns of staggering numbers and complex offshore routing codes. The legitimate real estate firm was nothing more than a massive corporate front. Derek was actively laundering tens of millions of dollars through his own brother's corporate business accounts, skimming heavily from wealthy private investors and hiding the massive illicit profits in untraceable Cayman Island trusts. He was exposing his own family to catastrophic federal criminal charges while quietly building an untouchable financial empire entirely for himself. But the massive financial fraud was not the most horrifying thing hidden in that safe. Tucked away behind the ledger was a thick red cardboard accordion file labeled simply with my sister's initials. HMC, Haley Marie Carver. I pulled the file out, my hands trembling slightly as I flipped open the heavy protective cover. Inside were 4 distinct sealed manila envelopes. I opened the very first one. It was a comprehensive premium life insurance policy taken out on Haley just 6 months ago. The guaranteed payout was $2 million. I quickly opened the second envelope, another massive policy from a completely different high-risk underwriter for $3 million. The third and fourth envelopes contained nearly identical legal documents, bringing the total insured value of my sister's life to a staggering $12 million. Every single policy listed Derek as the sole and completely irrevocable beneficiary. A cold, paralyzing wave of horror washed over me, freezing the blood solid in my veins. The scattered puzzle pieces violently slammed into place, forming a picture so utterly depraved it physically stole the breath from my lungs. The forced social isolation, the sudden terrifying escalation of physical violence, the aggressive demand for the lakefront property deeds before tomorrow night. Derek did not just want her family inheritance, he wanted her dead. He was meticulously staging an airtight paper trail. The property transfer would make it look exactly like she was quietly organizing her financial assets. The violently bruised wrists and the erratic, terrified behavior he was purposefully causing would perfectly support a tragic narrative of severe clinical depression or a sudden accidental overdose. He was going to perfectly execute the murder of my twin sister, collect $12 million in clean, completely untraceable insurance money, and walk away completely free to enjoy the millions he had stolen from his own family. The sheer calculated psychopathic evil of his plan radiated from the crisp white pages trembling in my hands. He had placed a specific, exact monetary value on her human life, and he was preparing to cash out. I stood paralyzed in the total darkness of the home office, clutching the damning legal documents tightly to my chest. The nauseating fear that had been gripping my stomach completely evaporated, replaced entirely by a terrifying and absolute mental clarity. The hot tears that desperately threatened to fall for my sister's immense pain were instantly vaporized by the searing, white-hot heat of my own absolute rage. Derek thought he had successfully trapped a weak, defenseless bird in an inescapable gilded cage. He truly thought he was the smartest, most powerful man in the room, pulling the strings of everyone around him with total and complete impunity. But he had made the most colossal, fatal mistake of his pathetic, arrogant life. He had forcefully invited a seasoned forensic accountant right into his private financial sanctuary. I did not just see dry numbers on a piece of paper. I saw a perfectly illuminated roadmap to his complete and total destruction. I reached deep into my pocket and pulled out a miniature, high-resolution digital scanning device I always securely carried for high-level corporate espionage audits. I meticulously scanned every single page of the illegal offshore ledgers, every single routing number, every hidden bank account, and every single life insurance policy. I perfectly captured the irrefutable digital proof of his massive financial crimes and his premeditated, terrifying murder plot. I carefully placed the physical documents back into the red accordion file exactly as I had originally found them. I returned the file to the dark safe alongside the black leather ledger and the heavy stacks of dirty cash. I pushed the heavy solid steel door closed and listened to the deeply satisfying mechanical click of the biometric locking mechanism perfectly re-engaging. I rigorously wiped down the dark glass keypad with the soft sleeve of my cashmere sweater, removing absolutely any microscopic trace of my thermal footprint. I slowly turned around and looked at the dark, oppressive luxury office one last time. Derek was sleeping peacefully upstairs, completely unaware that the concrete foundation of his entire criminal empire had just been permanently and irreparably fractured. He arrogantly believed he held absolutely all the cards, and that tomorrow night he would easily deliver his final crushing blow to a broken woman. But tomorrow night, at his lavish, pretentious family dinner, he would not be facing the terrified, submissive wife he had systematically and brutally destroyed. He would be facing me, and I was absolutely going to burn his entire world to the ground. I slipped out of the office, securely locking the heavy mahogany door behind me, and crawled back down the dark, freezing hallway, entirely ready to prepare for a devastating war. The next evening arrived with the suffocating heavy weight of an oncoming storm. I spent the entire afternoon meticulously preparing the lavish dining room under Derek's constant, terrifying supervision. He demanded absolute perfection. I polished the heavy silver flatware until my fingers actively ached and arranged the imported white orchids in the exact center of the massive, solid mahogany table. Every single physical movement I made was carefully calculated to project the tragic image of a completely broken woman. I kept my shoulders heavily slumped, my hazel eyes cast downward toward the floor, and my voice reduced to a pathetic, trembling whisper. The thick layer of professional theatrical makeup covering my left eye perfectly simulated the brutal, violent bruise he had given my sister just 24 hours ago. Derek watched me from the kitchen island, sipping his expensive scotch, with a smug, deeply satisfied smirk plastered across his handsome face. He truly believed his horrific physical violence had finally crushed the very last remaining ounce of defiance out of his terrified wife. By 7 o'clock, the grand, sprawling foyer echoed with the loud, pretentious voices of his wealthy elite family arriving for the celebratory dinner. Derek's father, Richard, walked through the front doors first, carrying the unmistakable, towering arrogance of a man who had never been told no in his entire privileged life. He wore a custom-tailored navy suit and looked around the smart home with a critical, aggressively judging eye. His wife, Patricia, followed closely behind him, dripping in heavy diamond jewelry and suffocating expensive floral perfume. She greeted me with a cold, tight-lipped smile that absolutely did not reach her eyes. Patricia had always deeply hated Haley, viewing my sister as a weak, middle-class gold digger who was entirely unworthy of their prestigious family name. Then came Derek's older brother, Marcus, a slightly softer, quieter version of their domineering father, accompanied by his wife, Jamila. Jamila was a sharp, incredibly brilliant corporate attorney. She was an African-American woman who had fought tooth and nail for her own success, and she was the only person in this toxic, suffocating family I actually respected. As I silently took their heavy winter coats, I noticed the subtle, tense shift in Jamila's perfect posture when she clearly saw the dark painted bruise on my face. She did not say a single word out loud, but her intelligent brown eyes narrowed with quiet, dangerous calculation. I filed that crucial mental note away for later use. We gathered around the massive dining table beneath the glaring, blinding light of a heavy crystal chandelier. The private catering staff served course after course of extravagant rich food, pan-seared scallops, herb-crusted rack of lamb, and expensive imported vintage wine flowing freely into heavy crystal goblets. The dinner conversation was exactly what you would expect from a family completely disconnected from the reality of normal human empathy. Richard boasted loudly about a recent ruthless corporate merger, while Derek desperately tried to impress his father by aggressively exaggerating his own real estate portfolio's quarterly returns. I sat completely silent at the far end of the long table, picking aimlessly at my expensive food, pushing the roasted vegetables around my pristine porcelain plate. I played the pathetic part of the invisible submissive wife, perfectly letting them completely ignore my very existence. But beneath the heavy linen tablecloth, my hands rested calmly in my lap, and my pulse was completely steady. I was a veteran forensic accountant sitting in a room full of arrogant financial criminals, and I knew exactly how to detonate the bomb Derek had so foolishly built. As the quiet catering staff cleared the main course plates and poured the final round of expensive dark espresso, Derek suddenly stood up at the head of the table. He tapped his heavy silver spoon against his crystal wine glass, demanding the absolute, undivided attention of the entire room. The meaningless, wealthy chatter immediately died down. Derek smiled a wide, charming, deeply fake smile that made my stomach aggressively churn with pure, unfiltered disgust. He reached down beside his chair and pulled out a thick, crisp manila folder. He tossed it casually onto the polished mahogany table and slid it down the long, smooth surface until it came to a complete stop directly in front of my plate. I stared down at the heavy ivory paper. It was the absolute, irrevocable transfer of the deed for my grandmother's lakefront property. Derek looked directly at his wealthy father and puffed out his chest proudly. I wanted to share some wonderful news with the family, he announced, his voice dripping with absolute false sincerity. As you all know, Haley has been struggling deeply with her mental health lately. It has been a very dark and difficult time for us, but she is finally taking the necessary steps to get her affairs in proper order. To relieve her of her stressful financial burdens, she has graciously decided to sign her inherited family property over to my commercial holding company tonight. A heavy, suffocating silence abruptly fell over the grand dining room. Patricia offered a condescending, slow clap, her heavy diamond bracelets clinking loudly in the quiet space. Richard nodded in stern, silent approval, raising his half-empty wineglass toward Derek in a very rare display of paternal validation. Every single person at the table turned their judging eyes toward me. The immense psychological pressure in the room was intentionally designed to completely crush any remaining shred of resistance. Derek had purposefully orchestrated this entire public spectacle to effectively trap my sister. He knew the real Haley absolutely hated public confrontation. He knew she would rather sign away her only remaining childhood sanctuary than endure the humiliating, condescending stares of his elite, terrifying family. Derek casually reached into his tailored breast pocket, pulled out a heavy, gold-plated fountain pen, and walked slowly down the entire length of the dining table. He stood directly behind my chair. I could feel the intense body heat radiating off his large frame. I could smell the sharp, expensive mint of his cologne, mixed with his underlying, arrogant sweat. He leaned down, placing both of his large, heavy hands on my shoulders, pressing his thumbs painfully into my fragile collarbones. He placed the heavy gold pen directly on top of the legal documents. "Go ahead, sweetheart." He whispered, his voice incredibly low and laced with a terrifying, hidden, violent threat. "Sign the papers so we can finally put all of this ugly business behind us permanently." I did not move a single muscle. I stared straight down at the stark black ink printed flawlessly on the pristine ivory paper. I read the specific legal name of his corporate holding company printed boldly at the top of the transfer deed. It was the exact same obscure shell company I had found hidden deep inside his black leather ledger last night. The exact same company he was actively using to launder tens of millions of dollars directly from his father's corporate business accounts. I slowly reached out and picked up the heavy gold fountain pen. Derek let out a quiet, arrogant sigh of absolute victory, believing he had finally broken me for good. But I did not uncap the pen. I did not move the gold tip anywhere near the dotted signature line. Instead, I gripped the solid metal cylinder firmly with both of my hands, my knuckles turning bright white under the glaring light of the heavy crystal chandelier. With a sudden, violently aggressive twist of my wrists, I snapped the expensive gold pen entirely in half. The sharp cracking sound echoed through the dead silent dining room exactly like a gunshot. Black ink exploded across the pristine ivory property deeds, completely ruining the legal documents and splashing violently onto the highly polished mahogany table. Someone at the table let out a sharp, terrified gasp of pure shock. Derek's hands instantly flew off my shoulders as he jumped back in total surprise, his custom-tailored suit jacket lightly splattered with the dark, permanent ink. I slowly pushed my heavy wooden chair back and stood up, standing completely straight. I did not look at Derek. I locked my intense gaze directly onto his powerful father, Richard. "I am not signing anything," I said, my voice completely clear, loud, and entirely devoid of the pathetic, submissive fear Derek fully expected to hear. "In fact, Richard, you should be extremely grateful that I am refusing to sign this fraudulent property transfer." The entire dining table froze in absolute stunned paralysis. Derek stepped forward, his handsome face flushing a deep, violent shade of crimson red. "Haley, shut your mouth right now," he hissed, his charming, polished facade completely shattering into tiny, jagged pieces. I ignored him completely, keeping my intense, unwavering gaze locked directly on the patriarchal head of the family. This property transfer is legally structured as a $0 capital contribution to Derek's primary holding LLC. I continued, my voice ringing out through the room with absolute clinical authority. Under Federal Tax Code Section 409A, transferring a heavily appreciated real estate asset into a corporate entity without fair market compensation triggers an immediate mandatory federal audit for suspected capital gains evasion. Richard's dark eyes narrowed sharply. The arrogant wine-fueled haze immediately vanished from his face, replaced entirely by the cold, highly calculating look of a ruthless billionaire aggressively protecting his wealth. I took a slow, deliberate step away from the ruined table, commanding the absolute attention of the entire room. If I sign this specific document, the Internal Revenue Service will immediately flag the transaction. And once federal agents open the financial books on Derek's holding company, they will not just look at my little lakefront cabin. They will execute a full forensic deep dive into the massive continuous offshore wire transfers Derek has been actively funneling through your primary corporate syndicates for the last 24 months. I let the heavy, devastating words hang in the dead, silent, suffocating air. Jamila sat perfectly still at the other end of the long table, her sharp, intelligent eyes wide with sudden, profound realization. I had just publicly accused the Golden Son of aggressively embezzling millions from his own incredibly powerful father. Furthermore, I added my tone dripping with absolute icy contempt. Any asset transfer executed under the documented threat of involuntary psychiatric confinement is legally classified as extreme coercive duress. It is a Class 2 federal felony. If this fake deed is filed tomorrow morning, I will personally walk into the federal prosecutor's office and hand them the entire fraudulent paper trail. Derek's entire towering body trembled with a dark, explosive, terrifying rage. He lunged forward aggressively, grabbing my upper arm with a bruising, terrifying force. "Get upstairs right now!" he roared, his furious voice physically shaking the delicate crystal glasses on the dining table. He fully intended to drag me out of the room and beat me into a bloody pulp right then and there. But before he could even pull me a single inch, Richard's heavy fist violently slammed down onto the mahogany table with a deafening crash. "Let her go, Richard commanded, his voice a terrifying low rumble that echoed through the room with absolute, undisputed authority. Derek froze, completely paralyzed by his father's sudden, aggressive intervention. Richard stood up, his cold, furious eyes darting rapidly between the ruined, ink-stained property deeds and his suddenly panicking favorite son. "What offshore wire transfers is she talking about, Derek?" His father demanded, the harsh words slicing through the tense air like a razor-sharp knife. Derek opened his mouth to speak, but absolutely no sound came out. He looked desperately around the lavish dining room, searching for any possible escape, but he was completely trapped. He could not physically attack me in front of all these wealthy, influential witnesses. He could not force me to sign the ruined legal documents, and he absolutely could not explain away the devastating financial accusations I had just laid perfectly at his father's feet. I easily pulled my arm out of Derek's weakened, shocked grip. I offered the stunned, silent family a polite, chillingly calm smile. "Thank you so much for the lovely dinner," I said, my voice perfectly steady and light. "I think I will retire for the evening." I turned my back on the monster who thought he could easily destroy my sister and walked slowly out of the grand dining room, leaving his entire fake life actively burning to the ground behind me. I walked away from the grand dining room with my spine perfectly straight and my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The deafening silence I left behind in that room was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I had just detonated a massive financial bomb in the center of their pristine mahogany table, and I needed a moment to let the sheer adrenaline filter out of my bloodstream. I moved down the long, dimly lit corridor of the West Wing, keeping my footsteps even and unhurried. I reached the lavish guest powder room near the sweeping staircase and pushed the heavy oak door open. The bathroom was a ridiculous monument to excessive wealth, covered in floor-to-ceiling marble, with gold-plated fixtures and a massive backlit mirror. I stepped inside, leaning heavily against the cold marble counter. I turned on the gold faucet, letting the freezing water run over my trembling hands. I splashed the icy water onto my neck, being incredibly careful not to disturb the thick layers of theatrical makeup covering my left eye. I looked at my reflection in the massive mirror. I was still wearing my sister's face, still wearing her conservative beige sweater, but the terrified, submissive victim was completely gone from my eyes. I took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to push the intense, lingering fury down into my stomach. I had successfully stopped the fraudulent property transfer and exposed Derek's massive embezzlement to his incredibly powerful father, but I also knew I had just put a massive target directly on my own back. I needed to figure out my next move before Derek managed to spin the narrative and regain control of his terrified family. Before I could even reach for a linen hand towel, the heavy oak door of the powder room suddenly swung open. Jamila stepped inside the small marble space. She moved with the quiet, lethal grace of a woman who was completely accustomed to commanding any room she walked into. She was dressed in a flawlessly tailored charcoal gray pantsuit that fit her tall, athletic frame perfectly. Without saying a single word, she reached behind her back and turned the heavy brass lock on the door. The sharp metallic click echoed loudly in the confined marble space. My muscles instantly tensed. My Krav Maga training flared to life, preparing my body for a rapid physical altercation. But Jamila did not raise her hands. She simply stood leaning back against the locked door, crossing her arms over her chest and staring at me with dark, piercing brown eyes. Those eyes seemed to look right through my constructed facade and directly into my soul. The air in the small room suddenly felt incredibly heavy and suffocating. We stood there in absolute dead silence for several agonizing seconds. The only sound was the low hum of the expensive ventilation system above us. Then, Jamila tilted her head slightly to the side. "Haley does not know Federal Tax Code Section 409A. She said, her voice completely flat and entirely devoid of any emotion. Haley does not know the legal definition of coercive duress, and she certainly does not have the backbone to look Richard straight in the eye and threaten him with a federal audit. Jamila took one slow, deliberate step toward me, her gaze completely unwavering. "So, I am going to ask you this exactly one time before I walk back out there. Before I walk back out there and let Derek throw you to the ravenous wolves in that dining room, you need to tell me the absolute truth. Who the hell are you?" A cold, sharp spike of pure panic pierced directly through my chest. I had been so intensely focused on completely destroying Derek that I had carelessly let my professional vocabulary slip out in front of the entire family. I had broken character in the absolute worst possible way. I stared at Jamila, my mind racing frantically through a million different desperate lies I could tell her right now. I could claim I had secretly hired a high-priced lawyer. I could claim I had been reading dense financial law books in the local public library. But as I looked closely at the powerful woman standing in front of me, I realized something crucial. I realized exactly how useless lying would be. I am a senior forensic accountant, and my entire career is built on reading tiny, subtle details that other people completely miss. I quickly evaluated Jamila standing there under the harsh bathroom lights. I looked at her expensive but incredibly understated jewelry. She was not wearing the heavy, gaudy diamonds that Patricia constantly paraded around to aggressively prove her unearned wealth. Jamila wore a simple, elegant vintage Cartier watch on her left wrist and a pair of modest, beautiful pearl studs. Her posture was not the relaxed, lazy slouch of old money inheritance. It was the rigid, perfectly controlled stance of a woman who had to work 10 times harder and be 10 times smarter than every single arrogant white man in this entire sprawling estate just to get a seat at their exclusive table. She was a highly successful African-American corporate attorney who had built her own massive career entirely from the ground up. She was completely self-made, and I suddenly understood with absolute crystal clarity that she deeply and profoundly hated Derek and his entire toxic, pretentious family. She despised their unearned arrogance, their casual daily cruelty, and their blatant, unchecked financial corruption. I let out a long, slow breath, completely dropping the pathetic, trembling posture of my broken sister. I stood up, perfectly straight, matching Jamila's tall, imposing height, and looked her directly in the eyes. I dropped the soft, breathless whisper I had been using all evening and let my natural, deep, steady voice return to the surface. "My name is Harper." I said the words, echoing clearly against the cold, polished marble walls of the quiet powder room. "I am Haley's identical twin sister. I am 31 years old, and I am a senior forensic accountant specializing in corporate cyber fraud." Jamila did not gasp. She did not stumble backward in shock. Her sharp brown eyes simply widened for a fraction of a second before her expression smoothed out into a look of profound, intense understanding. I watched her brilliant mind rapidly process the massive implication of my spoken words. She looked closely at my face, studying the dark painted bruise around my eye and the heavy exhaustion I was actively projecting. "Where is she?" Jamila asked, her voice dropping into a low, urgent whisper. "Where is the real Haley right now?" "She is locked securely inside my apartment in downtown Seattle," I replied, keeping my voice just as low and completely steady. "Derek severely fractured her right wrist last night. He beat her face in and told her if she did not sign that property deed over to his holding company tonight, he was going to kill her and throw her body into the freezing waters of the Puget Sound." I took a step closer to Jamila, laying all of my hidden cards completely out on the table. But the horrifying domestic abuse is just a convenient cover for what he is actually doing in the shadows. I broke into his hidden wall safe last night. I found his secret ledgers and his complex offshore routing numbers. Derek is actively laundering tens of millions of dollars out of Richard's primary corporate accounts. He is purposefully funneling the stolen money through Marcus and his business entities, directly exposing your husband and your own pristine law license to massive federal criminal charges and absolute total ruin. And worse, he has taken out $12 million in fraudulent life insurance policies on my sister. He is actively planning to murder her, frame it as a tragic mental health crisis, and walk away with a massive, untraceable fortune. Jamila's jaw clenched so hard I could actually see a small muscle feathering angrily in her cheek. The absolute fury that flashed through her dark eyes was not the explosive, volatile rage that Derek possessed. It was a cold, calculating, and highly destructive anger. The exact kind of anger that completely topples arrogant empires. She turned her head and looked sharply at the heavy oak door, listening to the muffled, chaotic shouting completely erupting from the dining room down the hall. Richard was aggressively demanding answers, and Derek was loudly panicking, trying desperately to lie his way out of the massive corner I had just created for him. Jamila turned back to me, her expression completely unreadable and entirely terrifying. "You made a massive mistake blowing your perfect cover with that obscure tax code," she whispered intensely to me. "But you also just gave me the exact weapon I have been desperately searching for to completely destroy him once and for all tonight, Harper." Jamila stood perfectly still in the confined marble space. The heavy weight of my words settled over her like a suffocating blanket. She did not panic. She did not doubt me for a single second. Her brilliant legal mind instantly processed the staggering magnitude of the life insurance policies and the terrifying reality of Derek's premeditated murder plot against my sister. I watched the profound realization wash over her sharp features. The bruises, the isolation, the sudden aggressive push for the property transfer, everything suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense to her. She took a slow, deep breath, her chest rising and falling rhythmically beneath her tailored charcoal suit. "You are telling me that arrogant sociopath actually plans to kill her," she whispered. Her voice laced with a cold, lethal edge that sent a shiver down my spine. I nodded slowly, maintaining intense eye contact. "He is building an airtight paper trail to frame it as a tragic mental health crisis," I replied, keeping my voice low. "I need to dismantle his entire financial network before he can execute his plan." Jamila closed her dark eyes for a brief moment. When she opened them again, the cold, calculating anger had crystallized into absolute, unwavering resolve. I have despised that man. From the moment I met him, she stated her tone completely flat and deadly serious. "I have watched him emotionally torture your sister for years, while the rest of this toxic family actively turned a blind eye. I always knew he was hiding dirty money, but I never imagined he was capable of meticulously planning a cold-blooded murder to line his own pockets." She took a step closer to me, closing the distance between us in the lavish powder room. "I am going to help you burn him to the ground, Harper. I am going to help you rip his entire pathetic empire apart, piece by piece, until there is absolutely nothing left but ashes." A profound sense of relief washed over me. I finally had an ally on the inside. I had a brilliant corporate attorney who knew exactly how the legal system worked and who hated Derek just as much as I did. We were no longer just two women trapped in a house full of predators. We were a highly coordinated threat. Jamila leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a barely audible whisper. "You need to understand exactly why I am willing to risk everything to help you," she said, her dark eyes blazing with an intense, fierce, protective fire. "It is not just about bringing Derek to justice for what he has done to Haley. He is actively destroying my life too." I stared at her, listening intently, as she laid out the devastating reality of her own situation. For the past 18 months, I have been quietly investigating the massive financial discrepancies in Marcus corporate accounts, she explained. "My husband is weak Harper. He is completely terrified of his domineering father, and he desperately craves his brother's arrogant approval. Derek knows this. Derek has been aggressively manipulating Marcus, using his accounts as a massive, untraceable wash cycle for the millions he is embezzling from the primary family syndicate. Every single stolen dollar flows directly through my husband's legal business entities before disappearing into those offshore trusts you found in the ledger." The horrifying implication of her words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. If the federal authorities uncover this massive money laundering operation, they will not just arrest Derek. They will arrest Marcus for actively facilitating the fraud. And because I am legally married to him and my name is tied to our joint financial assets, they will come directly after me. Jamila clenched her hands into tight fists, her perfectly manicured nails biting into her palms. "I have worked my entire life to build my corporate law career. I clawed my way to the top of my firm through sheer relentless determination. I will not allow that arrogant, entitled monster to completely destroy my law license and send me to federal prison just so he can buy another luxury sports car." She looked at me with absolute fierce determination. "I need the exact digital routing numbers connecting Derek's offshore accounts to the embezzled funds," she demanded softly. If I can legally prove Derek initiated every single wire transfer without Marcus' knowledge, I can completely immunize myself and force Marcus to testify against his brother. But I cannot access Derek's private network from the outside. His cybersecurity is too heavily encrypted. I nodded slowly, perfectly understanding her desperate legal strategy. I have a cloned access tag, I whispered back. I can get into his primary server rack in the basement. I just need the right hardware to extract the routing data without triggering his internal security alarms. Before Jamila could respond, a violent, heavy pounding suddenly erupted against the solid oak door of the powder room. The deafening sound echoed like physical gunshots in the confined marble space. "What the hell are you two doing in there?" Derek roared, his furious, muffled voice, completely distorted by his explosive, violent rage. "Open this damn door right now." My heart instantly slammed against my ribs in blind panic. I instinctively dropped my posture, rounding my shoulders and letting my head fall forward, instantly sliding back into the pathetic, broken character of his terrified wife. I could hear the heavy, aggressive scraping of his leather shoes against the hardwood floor outside. He was rattling the brass door handle with terrifying brute force, desperately trying to break the lock. "Are you whispering in there?" he bellowed aggressively, slamming his heavy fist against the thick wood again. "Haley, if you do not open this door in 3 seconds, I swear to God I will kick it completely off its hinges." The sheer terrifying reality of his violent threat paralyzed me. If he broke down the door and found us quietly conspiring, he would instantly know something was terribly wrong. He would completely lock down the estate, and we would lose our only chance to secure the financial evidence. But Jamila did not even flinch. She did not show a single ounce of fear. She reached out and grabbed my arm, giving it a sharp, reassuring squeeze. "Follow my lead," she mouthed silently, her dark eyes completely calm and fiercely focused. Without a second's hesitation, Jamila raised her voice to a loud, angry, theatrical pitch, completely drowning out Derek's aggressive pounding. "I am telling you, Haley, I simply cannot take it anymore," Jamila shouted, her voice echoing perfectly off the cold marble walls. "Marcus is completely useless. He spends more time desperately kissing his father's ring than he does actually listening to his own wife. I am absolutely sick and tired of playing the supportive partner while he lets his arrogant family walk all over us." I stared at Jamila in absolute awe as she perfectly delivered the flawless, convincing performance of a deeply frustrated wife venting her marital problems in the private sanctuary of a bathroom. It was the exact kind of mundane domestic drama that arrogant men like Derek completely dismissed and actively ignored. Outside the heavy oak door, the violent pounding abruptly stopped. The loud, aggressive rattling of the brass handle ceased entirely. Derek was standing out there listening to Jamila's loud, angry complaints about his own brother. His massive, fragile ego would never allow him to interrupt a conversation where Marcus was being verbally dismantled. It fed directly into his own delusional sense of absolute superiority over his older sibling. "I'm sorry, Jamila," I whispered back, forcing my voice to tremble pathetically loud enough for Derek to clearly hear through the heavy wood. "I know it is hard for you right now." Jamila rolled her eyes theatrically, maintaining her loud, frustrated tone. "It is exhausting, Haley," she shouted back, grabbing her expensive leather clutch from the marble counter. I just needed 5 minutes away from that suffocating dining room before I actually screamed. As she loudly complained, she quickly unzipped a tiny hidden compartment inside her designer bag. She reached in and pulled out a tiny, sleek, black, microscopic USB drive. It was no larger than the fingernail on my pinky finger, exactly the kind of highly illegal extraction hardware corporate spies use to completely clone encrypted servers. She stepped close to me, keeping her voice booming for Derek's benefit, while simultaneously whispering her true instructions directly into my ear. "You need to plug this directly into the primary uplink port on his basement router," she whispered intensely, pressing the tiny cold metal drive firmly into my sweaty palm. It contains an automated, aggressive extraction script. The second it connects, it will bypass his local firewalls and immediately begin downloading his entire offshore routing history. It will take exactly 4 minutes to completely clone the data. I closed my hand tightly around the microscopic drive, slipping it deep into the pocket of my beige cashmere sweater. I nodded my silent, absolute understanding. Do not let him catch you down there. She warned softly, her dark eyes blazing with fierce urgency. If he realizes what you are doing, he will kill you tonight, Harper. Jamila took a deep breath, smoothing out the invisible wrinkles in her flawless charcoal suit. She reached behind her back and loudly unlatched the heavy brass lock. She swung the solid oak door wide open. Derek was standing directly outside, his handsome face twisted into an ugly dark scowl, his hands resting aggressively on his hips. Problem? Jamila asked, her voice dripping with absolute cold, condescending disdain as she stared him down. Derek sneered, looking past her to glare violently at me, cowering by the sink, just making sure my wife is not having another one of her pathetic little episodes. He spat bitterly. Jamila scoffed, pushing past him with aggressive, calculated annoyance. Your wife is fine, Derek, she snapped coldly, walking away down the dim hallway. Try worrying about your own damn brother for once. I kept my head down, clutching my trembling hands together as I slowly stepped out of the powder room. Derek grabbed my arm roughly, shoving me toward the sweeping staircase. Go straight to your room, he hissed violently in my ear. I walked up the stairs, feeling the cold metal of the USB drive pressing against my thigh, knowing I was carrying the exact weapon that would completely destroy his life. The morning sun barely broke through the heavy, gray Seattle clouds, casting long, depressing shadows across the luxurious master bedroom. The atmosphere inside the massive estate was incredibly toxic and heavy. Derek was pacing the expensive hardwood floor like a violently caged predator. He was throwing custom-tailored suits and expensive silk ties into a heavy leather duffel bag. He was shouting into his cellular phone, aggressively demanding a sudden, urgent business meeting downtown with his private wealth managers. I knew exactly what that meant. My calculated threats at the grand dining table last night had completely rattled his arrogant cage. He was scrambling in a blind panic to cover his digital tracks and meet with his shady financial contacts to move the massive amounts of embezzled money before any potential federal audit could ever begin. He ended the phone call and glared at me with pure, unfiltered venom burning in his dark eyes. He pointed a rigid, threatening finger directly at my face and told me if I even thought about leaving this house today, he would make sure I was buried under a mountain of restrictive legal and psychiatric paperwork by midnight. He slammed the heavy bedroom door so hard the expensive framed pictures on the wall visibly rattled. I stood perfectly still at the large bay window, listening intently to his heavy, angry footsteps descend the sweeping mahogany staircase. A few agonizing moments later, I heard the deep, aggressive roar of his Porsche engine violently coming to life in the pristine garage. I watched his sleek black car speed frantically down the long manicured driveway and disappear completely through the heavy wrought iron security gates. The massive house instantly fell into a deafening, terrifying silence. I was finally entirely alone. I did not have a single second to waste. I pulled Jamila's microscopic black USB drive from the pocket of my beige cashmere sweater and gripped the tiny piece of metal tightly in my sweaty palm. I grabbed my professional leather work briefcase from beneath the bed and sprinted down the long carpeted hallway. My bare feet slapped rapidly against the freezing cold, imported marble floors as I bypassed the main living areas and headed directly toward the heavy reinforced steel door leading down to the basement. The basement of this multi-million-dollar estate was not a dusty storage area for old holiday decorations or forgotten family memories. It was a sterile, heavily climate-controlled fortress designed specifically to house the massive commercial-grade smart home servers and Derek's private, highly encrypted network infrastructure. I pushed the heavy metal door open and hurried down the solid concrete steps. The air down here was incredibly cold, biting sharply against my exposed skin, and it smelled faintly of electrical ozone and burning dust. The only illumination came from the long, endless rows of rapidly blinking blue and green LED indicators on the massive black metal server racks, standing menacingly in the exact center of the dark room. It looked exactly like the restricted data center of a mid-sized technology corporation, not the basement of a residential suburban home. I walked slowly toward the primary server rack, my trained eyes frantically scanning the chaotic, tangled web of thick black Ethernet cables and glowing orange fiber optic lines. I am a senior forensic accountant, and my highly specialized job frequently requires me to physically infiltrate hostile corporate networks to secure hidden financial data. I know complex network architecture intimately. I quickly located the primary uplink router, sitting proudly on the very top shelf of the massive steel reed. It was an extremely high-end commercial model, encased entirely in heavy, brushed aluminum. But as I reached my trembling hand out to plug Jamila's tiny extraction drive into the open access port, my blood instantly ran freezing cold. Bolted securely directly beneath the primary router was a secondary independent hardware module emitting a slow, menacing, pulsing red light. I recognized the specialized device immediately, and a wave of pure, terrifying nausea hit my stomach so hard I almost lost my footing. It was a military-grade physical tamper alert system. Derek was actively routing tens of millions of dollars in highly illegal stolen corporate funds through this specific network. He was absolutely not going to leave it physically unprotected. This highly specialized security hardware constantly monitored the active electrical current running through the primary internet connection. It was incredibly sensitive. If the physical connection dropped or experienced a sudden massive data traffic spike for more than 3 full seconds, the tamper alert system would instantly trigger a catastrophic automated lockdown. It would immediately sever all external network access sound, the main house alarms at a deafening volume, and send a high-priority emergency security breach notification directly to Derek's personal cellular phone. If I just blindly shoved Jamila's aggressive extraction script into the open port, the sudden massive surge in digital data traffic would instantly trip the sensitive hardware alarm. Derek would know immediately that someone was actively inside his secure network. He would instantly turn his fast car around and be back at the house in less than 20 minutes with absolute murderous intent. I could not just plug the drive in and wait. I had to completely bypass the physical security module first. I had to manually splice a secondary data line directly into the primary fiber optic cable and bridge the connection without disrupting the active data stream being monitored by the alarm. And I had to do the entire complex physical splice in less than 3 seconds. It was an incredibly dangerous technical maneuver that left absolutely zero margin for human error. My hands began to shake uncontrollably. I closed my eyes and took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing my panicked, racing mind back into the cold, sterile training rooms of my corporate agency. I actively visualized the exact internal wiring diagram of the commercial router. I needed a bridge cable. I dropped down heavily to my knees onto the hard concrete floor and rapidly opened my leather briefcase, pulling out a standard black Ethernet cord and a pair of heavy-duty wire strippers I always kept in my field kit. I worked with frantic, terrifying speed. I used the sharp metal blades of the wire strippers to carefully slice away the thick protective plastic casing of my spare cable, completely exposing the 8 delicate colored copper wires hidden inside. The bright orange, green, and blue wires looked incredibly fragile in the dim light. I meticulously twisted the corresponding data transmission wires together, creating a temporary exposed physical bridge loop. I stood back up and approached the massive server rack once again. The slow, pulsing red light of the tamper alert module seemed to actively mock me in the dark, freezing basement, threatening to completely destroy my sister's only chance at survival. I wiped the cold, nervous sweat from my forehead using the soft cashmere sleeve of my sweater. I placed my left hand firmly on the thick primary internet cable currently plugged securely into the router. I held my exposed rigged bridge cable tightly in my right hand, hovering directly next to the open secondary port. I had to unplug the mainline plug in my rigged bridge and forcefully reconnect the primary flow all simultaneously. The mental timer in my head started screaming. I violently yanked the primary cable entirely out of the router. The solid green connection lights on the entire rack instantly went dead. The entire massive network in the smart house completely dropped offline. 1 second. I forcefully shoved the exposed, jagged copper ends of my bridge cable directly into the secondary data port, aggressively forcing the delicate metal contacts to connect. 2 seconds. My hands were shaking so violently, I almost dropped the heavy primary cable completely onto the floor. I grabbed it tightly, ignoring the sharp pain of the exposed copper slicing into my fingers, and jammed it aggressively back into the main uplink port, completely closing the physical electrical loop. 3 seconds. I pulled my hands back and held my breath, entirely paralyzed in the freezing cold basement. I stared blindly at the secondary tamper module, waiting in absolute terror for the pulsing red light to turn solid and trigger the deafening main house alarms. I waited for the terrifying security notification to blast across Derek's phone downtown, but the heavy alarm did not sound. The oppressive, terrifying silence of the basement remained completely unbroken. A fraction of a second later, the solid green connection lights on the primary router flickered rapidly and snapped brightly back to life. The active data stream had been successfully restored in exactly 2.8 seconds. I let out a long, trembling, agonizing exhale, feeling completely dizzy and incredibly weak from the massive, sudden adrenaline dump. I leaned heavily against the cold steel server rack, trying desperately to slow my racing heart. I had successfully bypassed the military-grade physical hardware alarm. The network data was now running directly through my exposed rigged bridge, completely masking any sudden data surges from the sensitive security module monitoring the line. My hands were covered in tiny, painful bleeding cuts from handling the sharp, raw copper wires, but I absolutely did not care about the physical pain. I reached deep into my pocket and pulled out Jamila's microscopic black USB drive one final time. I carefully and deliberately inserted the tiny metal connector directly into the successfully bridged access port. A tiny invisible blue light flashed once on the sharp edge of the drive, indicating the highly aggressive extraction script had successfully engaged. The silent, massive digital robbery was finally underway. I stood perfectly still in the freezing room, staring at the rapidly blinking lights on the massive black router, knowing with absolute certainty that somewhere deep inside those heavily encrypted servers, the exact digital roadmap to Derek's total financial ruin was currently bleeding directly onto that tiny drive. All I had to do now was wait exactly 4 minutes for the download to complete, and we would finally have the weapon to destroy him. The tiny blue light on Jamila's microscopic drive blinked with a steady rhythmic pulse in the freezing darkness of the basement. I knelt on the hard concrete floor, staring intently at the glowing interface of my encrypted burner phone, which was now wirelessly tethered to the extraction hardware. The screen rapidly populated with thousands of lines of complex alphanumeric code. The aggressive script was doing exactly what Jamila promised. It was silently ripping through the heavy commercial firewalls of Derek's network, bypassing the secondary encryption layers and directly accessing his hidden offshore banking portals. But as I watched the staggering financial figures materialize on my small screen, a profound realization washed over me. I was a senior forensic accountant. I did not just have to settle for passively copying the digital routing numbers to use as legal evidence later. I had direct, unhindered administrator access to his active financial accounts right now. I could see the exact Cayman Island trusts and the shadowy Swiss holding companies where he had meticulously hidden the millions of dollars he aggressively embezzled from his own father's corporate syndicates. I could see the massive fraudulent life insurance policy premiums being automatically deducted from a heavily shielded domestic account. I saw phantom real estate LLCs, fake charitable foundations, and dummy vendor accounts, all designed to perfectly wash stolen cash. I felt a cold, calculated fury burn through my veins. I was not just going to gather evidence to expose him. I was going to completely financially eviscerate him before he even had the chance to walk into his downtown meeting. I opened a secondary secure terminal on my phone, utilizing a specialized routing software I had developed for high-stakes asset recovery operations. I was going to drain every single corrupted penny from his pristine, untouchable empire. My fingers flew across the digital keyboard of my phone, moving with frantic, terrifying precision. I started with the massive offshore accounts tied directly to his illegal real estate laundering operation. I isolated the original wire transfer routing numbers, identifying the exact legitimate investors and corporate syndicates Derek had ruthlessly defrauded over the past 2 years. With a few rapid keystrokes, I initiated a massive cascading series of reverse wire transfers. I watched with profound, immense satisfaction as the staggering 8-figure balances in his hidden Cayman Island accounts began to rapidly plummet. $9 million routed directly back into his father Richard's primary commercial holding firm. $4 million cleanly returned to the private equity partners he had deceitfully shorted in his last major suburban development deal. $2.5 million wired back into the municipal pension fund he had quietly drained during a corrupt city zoning project. I was meticulously dismantling his entire criminal infrastructure, keystroke by keystroke, ensuring the stolen capital was legally and permanently restored to its rightful owners. The sheer volume of the digital data flowing through my rigged physical bridge cable was immense, but the military-grade tamper alarm remained completely silent, perfectly bypassed by my earlier physical hardware hack. I was completely invisible inside his network, but returning the stolen money was only the very first phase of my financial execution. Derek still had millions of dollars in highly liquid personal assets sitting in offshore shadow accounts completely separate from the embezzled corporate funds. This was his private escape fund, the massive pile of dirty money he planned to use to live out his arrogant, wealthy fantasies after he successfully murdered my twin sister and collected the fraudulent life insurance payouts. I was absolutely not going to leave him a single dime to fund his legal defense. Before I left the lavish powder room last night, Jamila had provided me with one final, highly secure digital weapon. It was an encrypted routing number connected to a completely untouchable, blind legal escrow account she had quietly established under a protected shell corporation. Because Jamila was a brilliant and highly respected corporate attorney, she knew exactly how to structure the escrow so that the funds could only be released by a direct federal court order, making it entirely inaccessible to Derek or his high-priced private wealth managers. The money would sit there frozen in absolute legal purgatory until the federal authorities officially seized it as criminal evidence. I copied Jamila's secure routing data and pasted it directly into the master transfer terminal on my phone. I selected the remaining balance across all 12 of Derek's shadow accounts, $7.4 million. My thumb hovered directly over the execute command on my glowing screen. The freezing basement air felt suddenly electric. I took a deep breath, letting the lingering image of my sister's bruised and battered face fuel my final action. I pressed the button. The processing icon spun rapidly for 3 agonizing seconds before the screen flashed a brilliant, satisfying green. Transfer initiated. I watched the staggering multi-million-dollar balances instantly drop to absolute zero. The massive, untouched wealth Derek had spent years violently and ruthlessly accumulating was completely wiped out in a matter of seconds. I had successfully transformed the wealthy, arrogant predator into an absolute financial ghost. He had absolutely nothing left, but high-level international wire transfers leave an unavoidable digital footprint, and Derek was not a completely careless criminal. He utilized highly illegal dark web monitoring services to protect his stolen assets, and right at that exact moment, my aggressive financial sweep triggered a massive silent alarm completely outside of the physical smart home network. Halfway across the bustling city of Seattle, Derek was sitting inside his sleek black Porsche, idling aggressively in heavy morning traffic on Interstate 5. The heavy rain beat relentlessly against his expensive tinted windshield, perfectly matching his foul and violently explosive mood. He was actively barking vicious, aggressive orders into his cellular phone, screaming at his private wealth managers to prepare an immediate transfer of all his liquid assets into untraceable cryptocurrency. He was completely unaware that his entire world had just been burned to the ground. But then, his secure encrypted secondary phone, the burner device he kept strictly hidden in the inside pocket of his custom-tailored suit jacket, violently vibrated against his chest. It was a heavy, continuous vibration that signaled a maximum priority security breach. He ended his voice call abruptly and pulled the heavy black device out, staring down at the dark, illuminated screen. A high-priority, encrypted text message blared in bright, jarring red letters across the digital display. Warning: catastrophic account depletion detected. Multiple international wire transfers successfully initiated. Master offshore balances completely reduced to zero. Derek stopped breathing completely. The arrogant, wealthy facade he wore like a protective suit of armor instantly shattered into a million jagged, irrecoverable pieces. The thick, heavy air inside his luxury sports car suddenly felt entirely deprived of oxygen. He stared blindly at the terrifying notification, his alcohol-soaked brain desperately trying to comprehend the sheer, impossible reality of the digital alert. His offshore accounts were supposed to be completely untraceable, protected by the most advanced digital security massive amounts of dirty money could buy. Absolutely no one had the master access codes except for him. He frantically swiped his trembling thumb across the screen, opening his primary dark web monitoring portal, hoping desperately that it was just an elaborate system glitch. But the raw data stared back at him with cold, absolute finality. $0 and 0 cents. And then a second automated notification flashed brightly across his screen, showing the exact physical IP address where the massive unauthorized transfers had just originated. It was his own home network. It was his own highly secure basement server rack. The profound, horrifying realization hit him like a physical blow to the head, violently snapping his neck back against the expensive leather headrest. He was not being hacked by some anonymous international cyber syndicate operating out of Eastern Europe. He was being actively robbed from inside his own impregnable fortress by the very woman he had left cowering and completely broken in the master bedroom. The terrifying, submissive wife he thought he had completely destroyed had somehow miraculously bypassed his biometric locks, shattered his military-grade network security, and completely drained his entire criminal empire. But as the sheer impossibility of the situation settled over him, a darker, more terrifying thought pierced through his panicked mind. Haley did not know how to bypass an encrypted server. Haley did not know how to execute complex international wire transfers. The woman in his house was not the weak, broken victim he had meticulously tortured for years. A dark, explosive, murderous rage instantly consumed him, entirely erasing any lingering trace of his polished, civilized humanity. His hands gripped the leather steering wheel so tightly, his knuckles turned entirely white, and the thick veins in his forearms visibly bulged. He threw his expensive phone onto the passenger seat and violently wrenched the steering wheel hard to the right. He illegally swerved his heavy sports car directly across 3 lanes of congested highway traffic, completely ignoring the loud, angry horns and the screeching tires of the terrified drivers swerving dangerously to avoid hitting him. He slammed his foot aggressively down on the accelerator, the powerful, finely tuned engine roaring like a wounded, massive beast. He spun the car entirely around at the nearest emergency median, tearing up the wet grass and completely abandoning his urgent downtown meeting. He was racing back to the sprawling suburban estate with absolute terrifying speed, his mind focused entirely on pure, unfiltered violence. He no longer cared about the missing property deeds or the fraudulent life insurance policies he had carefully orchestrated. He was going to brutally tear his own house apart with his bare hands, and he was going to violently end the life of whoever was currently standing inside his basement. Down in the freezing dark room, my phone screen suddenly flashed with a severe proximity alert. The master network administrator had just forcefully pinged the local router from a rapidly moving mobile IP address. He knew exactly what I had done. My blood ran completely cold, freezing solid in my veins. Derek was coming back. My encrypted phone vibrated violently against the hard concrete floor of the freezing basement. The sudden, aggressive buzzing sound completely shattered the terrifying dead silence of the subterranean room. I ripped my eyes away from the rapidly flashing blue light of the extraction drive and stared down at the glowing digital screen. It was an emergency text message from Jamila. Her words were brief and laced with absolute, unfiltered panic. "He is coming back. Get out right now." My heart instantly slammed into my ribcage with the devastating force of a physical blow. The cold, calculated forensic accountant inside my brain immediately began running the terrifying mathematical variables. Jamila would have sent that warning the exact second Derek abruptly ended his phone call with his private wealth managers downtown. Factoring in the heavy morning Seattle traffic and his aggressive, reckless driving habits, I had a maximum window of maybe 12 to 14 minutes before his car violently pulled into the long, sweeping driveway. I looked desperately at the digital progress bar glowing brightly on my secure extraction terminal. The alphanumeric code was flying across the screen, but the overall completion status was hovering agonizingly at 95%. I only needed 45 more seconds to completely secure the entire encrypted offshore ledger, including the highly sensitive dummy vendor accounts he used to pay the fraudulent life insurance premiums. Just 45 tiny seconds to guarantee his absolute legal destruction and permanently save my sister's life. But I could already hear the distant, terrifying roar of a finely tuned sports car engine tearing recklessly down the wet suburban streets, completely ignoring the residential speed limits. Derek was driving like a man possessed by pure, unfiltered violence, and I knew exactly what would happen if he caught me physically trapped down here in his restricted network data center. I had to make the most agonizing professional decision of my entire life. I reached out with trembling, sweating hands and violently ripped Jamila's microscopic extraction drive straight out of the rigged access port, completely aborting the final 5% of the massive digital download. The screen on my phone instantly flashed a bright, jarring red warning, indicating a critical data interruption, but I had absolutely no time to care about corrupted residual files. I had to erase every single physical trace of my unauthorized presence before I fled the scene. I grabbed the exposed copper bridge cable I had painstakingly spliced together earlier and violently yanked it entirely out of the heavy aluminum router. The entire massive black server rack instantly went dead dark as the local smart network dropped completely offline. I had exactly 3 terrifying seconds before the military-grade physical tamper alarm triggered its catastrophic automatic security protocol. I grabbed the thick black primary internet cable and aggressively shoved it back into the main uplink port, forcing the connection to instantly re-establish. The solid green indicator lights flickered rapidly and stabilized perfectly. The slow-pulsing red light of the physical security module remained completely quiet, entirely oblivious to the massive digital robbery that had just occurred. I shoved the rigged Ethernet cable and my heavy-duty wire strippers back into my professional leather briefcase, zipping it shut with frantic, terrifying speed. I shoved Jamila's microscopic drive deep into the front pocket of my beige cashmere sweater, praying to whatever higher power existed that the 95% I had managed to successfully capture was enough evidence to send him to a federal penitentiary for the rest of his natural life. I grabbed my heavy briefcase and sprinted up the solid concrete stairs, my bare feet slipping slightly on the cold, unforgiving surface. I pushed my entire body weight against the heavy reinforced steel door and burst into the main floor hallway. The sprawling multi-million-dollar estate was completely silent, but the ambient air felt incredibly heavy and suffocating, like the massive atmospheric pressure dropping rapidly right before a devastating Category 5 hurricane. I ran frantically toward the sweeping mahogany staircase, intending to grab my shoes from the front foyer and escape directly through the heavy glass patio doors at the back of the property. If I could just make it to the thick tree line bordering the massive estate, I could disappear completely into the heavy, freezing Seattle rain and find my way back to my downtown apartment. But as my hand touched the smooth, polished wood of the elegant banister, the terrifying, high-pitched screech of burning rubber violently pierced the quiet suburban morning. Derek's black Porsche aggressively violently slammed into the long, manicured driveway, skidding wildly across the wet, slick asphalt. He did not even bother pulling into the pristine multi-car garage. He parked the heavy luxury vehicle horizontally across the front walkway, completely tearing up the expensive imported landscaping. I could hear him violently throwing his car door open, the heavy metal slamming shut with the explosive, deafening force of a bomb. He was already here. I completely abandoned my logical plan to retrieve my shoes. I spun around and sprinted barefoot across the freezing, imported marble floors of the grand foyer, heading directly for the heavy, solid oak back door that led out into the sprawling forested backyard. I reached the solid wood door and frantically grabbed the heavy brass handle, aggressively pulling it downward with all of my physical strength. It did not budge a single millimeter. I violently yanked it again, my panicked breath coming in short, desperate gasps, but the internal smart locking mechanism was completely rigid and entirely unresponsive. A sudden deafening mechanical groan echoed violently from deep inside the thick walls of the massive house. I stumbled backward, staring in absolute sheer horror at the floor-to-ceiling bay windows, lining the expensive, luxurious living room. Heavy, impenetrable steel security shutters were aggressively sliding down from their hidden ceiling compartments, completely sealing the thick architectural glass behind solid, reinforced metal. Derek had bypassed the local internal smart network and utilized his master override cellular application to instantly trigger the maximum tier lockdown protocol, usually reserved for armed home invasions. The heavy steel shutters crashed against the marble windowsills with a terrifying, definitive boom that vibrated straight through the soles of my bare feet. The massive, sprawling estate was instantly plunged into absolute, suffocating, pitch-black darkness. The heavy reinforced deadbolts on every single exterior door aggressively engaged, simultaneously locking perfectly into place with a loud, synchronized metallic click. I was entirely trapped inside the sprawling luxury fortress. I was entirely locked inside a pitch-black steel cage with a highly motivated, wealthy predator who had absolutely nothing left to lose and who was currently fueled by a murderous, explosive rage. A heavy, terrifying click echoed loudly from the front foyer. The state-of-the-art biometric fingerprint scanner had just successfully accepted Derek's master entry code. The heavy oak front door slowly pushed open, spilling a single narrow slice of gray, rainy daylight into the pitch-black corridor before violently slamming shut again and completely sealing the darkness. I pressed my entire body flat against the cold, textured silk wallpaper of the main hallway, trying desperately to slow my frantic, rapid breathing so he would not hear the desperate air entering my lungs. I could hear his heavy, wet leather shoes stepping slowly and deliberately onto the imported marble floor. He did not immediately yell. He did not violently tear through the house, throwing expensive furniture or screaming my sister's name. The absolute dead silence of his arrival was infinitely more terrifying than any explosive, violent rage could ever be. He was actively hunting. He was utilizing the terrifying, calculated, predatory patience of a man who knew his victim had absolutely nowhere left to run in the entire world. "Haley," he called out softly, his deep, smooth voice echoing chillingly through the dark, cavernous living room. "I know exactly what you just did, sweetheart. I know you are hiding in the dark, trying to be incredibly brave right now." The sheer condescending arrogance in his smooth, calculated tone made my blood run completely freezing cold. He genuinely still believed he was actively hunting his broken, terrified wife. He believed he was dealing with the weak, submissive victim he had spent 5 long years meticulously dismantling piece by piece until she had absolutely nothing left to defend herself with. He had absolutely no idea he had just locked himself inside a pitch-black house with a highly trained forensic accountant who had spent 7 years mastering the brutal physical arts of Krav Maga and who currently possessed the exact digital key to completely destroy his entire existence. But my extensive tactical combat training also strictly reminded me of a very harsh physical reality I could not simply ignore. Derek outweighed me by at least 80 pounds of pure aggressive muscle, and he was currently fueled by the explosive, highly dangerous adrenaline of a desperate man whose multi-million-dollar empire had just been burned completely to the ground. I absolutely could not fight him in the wide-open, expansive spaces of the grand foyer or the massive living room where his sheer size and long physical reach would give him a massive, insurmountable advantage in a striking physical contest. I needed to intelligently use the massive, sprawling layout of the dark smart home perfectly against him. I needed to aggressively force him into a highly restricted close quarters physical engagement where I could easily maximize my joint lock leverage and completely neutralize his massive towering size advantage before he even realized what was happening. The master bedroom suite at the very top of the sweeping stairs had multiple narrow hallways, tight corners, and heavy solid wood doors that I could brilliantly use as tactical defensive choke points. I dropped down incredibly low to the freezing marble floor, ignoring the sharp, biting cold against my exposed skin, and began to crawl completely silently toward the sweeping grand staircase, intending to draw him slowly and carefully up into the complex, restricted corridors of the second floor. The ultimate terrifying high-stakes game of cat and mouse had officially begun in the absolute suffocating darkness, and only one of us was going to walk out of this steel fortress alive. The pitch-black darkness of the sprawling second floor felt incredibly thick and heavy, pressing against my skin like a physical weight. I crawled silently up the remaining carpeted stairs, my bare feet making absolutely no sound as I navigated the familiar layout of the massive estate entirely by memory. Below me, the terrifying echo of Derek's heavy leather shoes slowly pacing the grand foyer sent violent shivers directly down my spine. He was not rushing. He was systematically clearing every single room on the ground floor, savoring the terrifying psychological hunt. I reached the landing and moved swiftly toward the master bedroom suite, positioned at the very end of the long, narrow corridor. This was my chosen battleground. The architectural layout of the master suite featured a highly restricted entryway. A short hallway flanked by heavy, solid wood closet doors that perfectly funneled anyone entering into a tight, inescapable physical bottleneck. I slipped inside the massive bedroom and pressed my back firmly against the cold wall, entirely hidden in the suffocating shadows right behind the heavy mahogany door. I forced my racing heart to slow down, inhaling the stale air through my nose and exhaling silently through my parted lips. My Krav Maga instructor always heavily emphasized that in a close-quarters physical engagement, the person who controls the breathing controls the absolute outcome of the fight. I waited in the deafening silence, feeling the cold sweat drip slowly down the back of my neck. Minutes dragged by like agonizing hours. Then I heard the unmistakable, heavy creak of the wooden staircase. Derek was finally coming up. His footsteps were no longer slow and calculated. They were heavy, aggressive, and incredibly fast. The terrifying reality of his vanished offshore millions was completely overriding his arrogant patience. He was boiling over with a dark, explosive, murderous rage. I heard him violently kick open the heavy door to the guest bedroom down the hall, the solid wood crashing deafeningly against the drywall. "Where are you, Haley?" He roared, his deep voice completely distorted by pure, unfiltered fury. "You cannot hide from me in my own house." I gripped my trembling hands into tight, solid fists, keeping my elbows perfectly tucked against my ribs in a classic defensive posture. His heavy footsteps aggressively charged down the hallway, heading directly toward the master suite. He did not bother turning the brass handle. He raised his heavy leather shoe and violently kicked the solid mahogany door perfectly off its internal latch. The heavy wood flew inward, crashing violently against the wall, mere inches from my hidden face. A blinding white beam of light instantly completely pierced the absolute darkness of the bedroom. He had grabbed a heavy tactical metallic flashlight from his emergency supply kit downstairs. The aggressive bright beam violently swept across the massive four-poster bed, the expensive antique vanity, and the heavy velvet curtains, completely missing my concealed position behind the open door. He stepped aggressively into the room, crossing the critical threshold of the narrow entryway. This was my one single tactical opportunity. I did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. I lunged forward out of the absolute pitch-black shadows, completely abandoning any defensive strategy, and launched a massive, aggressive, preemptive strike. I drove the solid heel of my right foot violently into the sensitive back of his knee, aggressively targeting the primary joint. Derek let out a sharp, shocked grunt as his massive leg buckled entirely under his own towering weight. The heavy tactical flashlight flew out of his hand, clattering loudly across the hardwood floor and spinning wildly, casting chaotic, erratic shadows against the bedroom walls. I immediately followed up by driving a brutal, vicious elbow strike directly toward the side of his jaw, hoping to completely neutralize his massive physical advantage before he could even recover. But I severely underestimated the terrifying, explosive power of a man completely unhinged by total financial ruin. My elbow connected solidly with his thick neck, but instead of dropping completely to the floor, Derek let out a deafening, furious roar. He spun around with terrifying lightning speed, completely ignoring the massive physical pain. His massive heavy arm swung blindly through the dark air, violently striking my left shoulder with the devastating force of a speeding freight train. The sheer aggressive impact threw me entirely off balance, sending me crashing violently backward into the heavy, solid oak dresser. The intense, blinding pain radiating through my shoulder threatened to completely paralyze my entire body, but I forced myself to instantly roll sideways, avoiding his next massive, crushing blow. Derek aggressively lunged forward, completely closing the physical distance between us in a single, terrifying stride. He was no longer trying to intimidate me. He was actively trying to kill me, right here in the dark bedroom. He grabbed a heavy crystal vase from the top of the dresser and violently swung it directly at my head. I ducked sharply, feeling the rush of displaced air, exactly as the heavy crystal shattered deafeningly against the solid drywall behind me, raining thousands of tiny, sharp glass shards down onto my bare shoulders. I completely abandoned my complex joint lock techniques and resorted to pure, desperate, visceral survival. I drove my knee violently upward, aiming directly for his groin, but his massive, heavy thighs aggressively blocked the desperate strike. He lunged forward entirely, using his towering 80-pound weight advantage to aggressively push me backward until my spine slammed violently against the cold, hard bedroom wall. I was completely physically trapped. His massive, heavy hands shot out violently, grabbing my upper arms with a bruising, terrifying force, perfectly pinning me against the floral wallpaper. I struggled wildly aggressively, kicking my bare feet against his shins and violently twisting my torso, but his grip was like an absolute, inescapable steel vice. He was breathing incredibly heavily, his chest heaving violently against mine. He smelled intensely of stale, expensive scotch and sharp, acidic sweat. "You stupid, pathetic bitch," he spat, his face mere inches from mine, his dark eyes burning with a terrifying, murderous intensity, illuminated only by the faint, erratic beam of the dropped flashlight rolling on the floor. "You actually thought you could steal my money? You actually thought you could destroy my entire life and just walk away?" I stared directly back into his violent, furious eyes, completely refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing my fear. I aggressively twisted my left arm desperately, trying to break his bruising grip, but the sudden movement only infuriated him further. He let out a dark, terrifying snarl and violently shifted his right hand from my arm directly toward my throat. He intended to completely cut off my air supply and violently choke the absolute life out of me right against the bedroom wall. In a desperate, frantic attempt to protect my exposed neck, I violently ducked my chin downward and aggressively twisted my entire upper body to the right. His massive, heavy hand missed my throat entirely, but his thick, aggressive fingers tightly caught the heavy, rolled collar of my beige cashmere sweater. Derek violently yanked his arm backward, intending to forcefully throw me completely across the room onto the hardwood floor. The expensive, delicate fabric of the cashmere sweater instantly completely gave way under his massive brute strength. A loud, sharp tearing sound violently echoed through the dark bedroom as the thick fabric violently ripped completely open from my left shoulder all the way down across my right collarbone. The violent physical force of the tear sent me stumbling awkwardly forward, but I quickly caught my balance, heavily panting and preparing for his next, terrifying lethal strike. But the next strike never came. The violent, explosive struggle in the dark room abruptly completely ceased. It was as if someone had instantly pulled the invisible plug on his towering, explosive rage. I stood completely frozen, heavily gasping for necessary air, staring defensively at the massive man standing just 3 feet in front of me. Derek was standing absolutely perfectly still. His large chest was heavily heaving, but his massive hands had completely dropped to his sides. His dark eyes were entirely locked onto the exposed torn area of my beige sweater. The dropped tactical flashlight on the hardwood floor was perfectly angled, pointing a stark, harsh beam of bright white light directly upward, illuminating the completely exposed skin of my neck and my right collarbone. He stared at my skin with a profound, terrifying intensity. His entire face went completely slack. The dark, explosive, violent rage that had possessed him just 3 seconds ago instantly, violently evaporated, replaced entirely by a profound, chilling, absolute shock. My heart slammed violently against my ribs as my frantic mind instantly perfectly understood exactly what he was looking at. When my identical twin sister, Haley, and I were exactly 10 years old, we spent the entire summer running wildly through the thick woods behind our grandmother's inherited lakefront cabin. One humid July afternoon, Haley decided to bravely climb the massive ancient oak tree near the dark water. She slipped on a patch of wet green moss and violently fell more than 15 feet directly onto the hard, unforgiving, exposed tree roots below. The devastating physical impact severely shattered her right collarbone into 3 distinct, jagged pieces. The emergency reconstructive surgery required a thick titanium plate and 12 heavy metal screws. It saved her mobility, but the rushed rural emergency room surgeon left a massive, thick, jagged pink scar perfectly entirely traversing the delicate skin of her right collarbone. It was a highly distinct, permanent physical blemish she carried for the rest of her entire life. It was a deep, permanent scar that her husband, Derek, intimately, violently knew existed. But as the harsh, bright, white beam of the tactical flashlight intensely illuminated my torn, exposed skin, there was absolutely no thick, jagged pink scar to be seen. My right collarbone was completely, entirely smooth, flawless, and perfectly unblemished. I watched the profound, terrifying realization aggressively wash over Derek's handsome, arrogant face. I watched his brilliant, calculating criminal mind rapidly, completely process the massive, impossible visual evidence standing perfectly right in front of him. The complete lack of terrified, submissive cowering. The aggressive, highly trained physical Krav Maga counterattacks in the dark kitchen. The profound, absolute knowledge of complex Federal Tax Code Section 409A at the grand dining table. The highly sophisticated military-grade network. Bypass in the freezing basement. The massive, flawless digital execution of complex international offshore wire transfers. The absolute, impossible, horrifying truth completely, violently slammed into his brain with the devastating, unstoppable force of a runaway freight train. The woman he had been physically fighting, the woman who had just completely, systematically, and utterly destroyed his entire multi-million-dollar criminal empire, was absolutely not the broken, terrified, submissive wife he had spent 5 years meticulously abusing. He took a slow, trembling, terrified step backward, entirely away from me. The torn piece of beige cashmere fabric fell limply from his trembling fingers, silently hitting the hardwood floor. He looked directly up from my perfectly smooth, exposed collarbone and stared deeply, entirely into my cold, unforgiving hazel eyes. "You are the twin," he whispered, his voice trembling with a profound, terrifying, absolute dread. The absolute silence that followed his terrifying realization was heavier than any physical weight I had ever experienced in my entire life. He did not yell. He did not immediately attack me again. He simply stood there in the dark, completely paralyzed by the massive, catastrophic scale of his own profound, arrogant ignorance. He had arrogantly, meticulously planned the perfect, cold-blooded murder of my twin sister, entirely convinced he held absolutely all the cards and all the immense power. He had absolutely no idea that by violently forcing her out of this house, he had unknowingly actively invited her exact identical reflection back inside. He had invited a highly trained, ruthless forensic accountant directly into his secure, restricted inner sanctum. I did not move a single muscle to cover my torn, exposed skin. I stood perfectly straight, dropping the pathetic, frightened posture entirely. I let the cold, absolute truth of my identity radiate perfectly through the dark, confined bedroom. "Yes, Derek," I said, my natural, deep, perfectly steady voice cutting through the heavy, silent air like a violently sharpened blade. "I am the twin, and you have absolutely no idea what is coming next." The absolute silence that followed his terrifying realization was heavier than any physical weight I had ever experienced in my entire life. He did not yell. He did not immediately attack me again. He simply stood there in the pitch-black darkness, entirely paralyzed by the massive, catastrophic scale of his own profound, arrogant ignorance. He had meticulously planned the perfect, cold-blooded murder of my twin sister, convinced he held absolutely all the cards and all the immense power. He had absolutely no idea that by violently forcing her out of this house, he had unknowingly actively invited her exact identical reflection back inside. I did not move a single muscle to cover my torn, exposed skin. I stood perfectly straight, dropping the pathetic, frightened posture entirely. I let the cold, absolute truth of my identity radiate perfectly through the dark, confined bedroom. "Yes, Derek," I said, my natural, deep, perfectly steady voice cutting through the heavy, silent air like a violently sharpened blade. "I am the twin." The profound shock on his face slowly melted away, replaced by something much colder and infinitely more dangerous. The explosive rage was completely gone. He was no longer a frantic, angry husband throwing a violent temper tantrum. He had shifted entirely into a cornered, highly calculating psychopath. He took a slow, deep breath, smoothing the lapels of his expensive, tailored suit jacket. "Well," he whispered softly, his voice entirely devoid of any human emotion. "That certainly complicates things." He slowly backed away from me, never breaking our intense eye contact. He moved deliberately toward the heavy, solid oak nightstand on the far side of the massive four-poster bed. I knew exactly what he was doing. I braced my legs, preparing to aggressively lunge forward, but he was incredibly fast. He pulled open the top drawer and retrieved a heavy, matte black registered firearm. He racked the metal slide with a deafening mechanical clack that echoed violently in the dark bedroom. The harsh white beam from the dropped flashlight perfectly caught the cold steel barrel now pointing directly at my chest. "Do not move a single muscle." "Harper," he commanded, his voice eerily, completely calm. I froze entirely. My extensive Krav Maga training could easily overcome a massive physical grappling disadvantage, but it absolutely could not outrun a speeding lead bullet fired from exactly 4 feet away. Derek gestured sharply with the heavy weapon, directing me toward a massive solid wood armchair, positioned directly near the shattered bay window. "Sit down, right now," he ordered coldly. I walked slowly, keeping my empty hands raised high in the freezing air, and lowered myself carefully into the heavy chair. He kept the dark weapon aimed perfectly at my heart while he reached deep into his suit pocket. He pulled out a thick, heavy bundle of industrial-grade plastic zip ties. He had likely purchased them specifically to restrain my sister before he murdered her. "Turn around and put your hands completely behind the chair," he demanded. I obeyed silently, pressing my back firmly against the hard, unforgiving wood. He violently yanked my arms backward, wrapping the thick plastic ties aggressively around my wrists. He pulled them so incredibly tight, the hard plastic instantly bit deep into my skin, completely cutting off the blood circulation to my fingers. He quickly secured my bare ankles to the heavy, front wooden legs of the chair with 2 more thick plastic restraints. I was entirely physically immobilized, trapped in the dark, suffocating room. Derek stepped back and let out a dark, terrifying laugh. He picked up the heavy tactical flashlight from the floor and placed it carefully on top of the tall dresser, angling the bright white beam downward so it completely illuminated my trapped body like a tragic stage play. He began pacing slowly back and forth across the hardwood floor, lightly, rhythmically tapping the cold steel barrel of his gun against his thigh. "You know, Harper, I really have to hand it to you," he said, a sickeningly arrogant smile spreading across his handsome face. "You completely successfully fooled me. You walked right into my home, bypassed my military-grade network security, and actually managed to completely drain my hidden offshore accounts. You are an incredibly brilliant woman, but you are also incredibly stupid. You bravely cornered a highly dangerous predator inside a locked steel cage, and you completely forgot that I hold the ultimate absolute trump card." He stopped pacing and leaned entirely into my personal space, the sharp, acidic smell of his stale scotch washing over my face. "You see, your little financial stunt downstairs just forced me to completely accelerate my timeline and massively adjust my primary strategy. You stole $7 million from me tonight. But your pathetic, terrified sister is heavily insured for $12 million. And since you two are perfectly genetically identical, I just realized something truly spectacular. I do not just have to settle for $12 million anymore." I stared at him, my blood running completely freezing cold as his terrifying new plan rapidly crystallized in the dark room. "You violently broke into my house tonight." He continued, his voice dripping with pure psychopathic glee. "A violent, aggressive home invasion gone tragically, horribly wrong. I caught the dangerous, unknown intruder actively robbing my dark bedroom, and I was legally forced to defend my property with my registered firearm. It is a completely justified legal self-defense shooting. The local police department will absolutely congratulate me for protecting my home. And then, once the coroner wheels your dead body out of my house in a heavy black bag, I am going to use my massive remaining resources to hunt down my missing, traumatized wife. When I finally find her hiding in whatever pathetic little hole you stuffed her in, I will completely finish the original job, double the tragic family losses, double the massive insurance payout, $24 million of completely clean, totally untraceable cash, and absolutely no one will ever suspect a single thing because the evidence died right here in this chair." I sat perfectly still in the heavy wooden chair, listening intently to his horrifying, deranged monologue. The heavy industrial zip ties were aggressively digging into my raw skin, causing a searing, intense physical pain, but I actively pushed the sensation entirely out of my mind. In my long career as a senior forensic accountant, I do not just sit at a desk looking at boring spreadsheets. I regularly conduct high-stress corporate interrogations with desperate, arrogant executives who are facing massive federal prison sentences. I know absolutely everything about the highly fragile psychology of a cornered, extreme narcissist. I know that their massive, inflated ego is always their absolute biggest fundamental vulnerability. They desperately need to feel intellectually superior to everyone else in the room. They desperately need a captive audience to perfectly validate their own brilliant, perceived genius. I needed to keep him actively talking. I needed to buy precious critical minutes for Jamila to execute her digital security override from the outside. "Derek, I said, my voice perfectly steady and entirely laced with a calculated, subtle tone of professional respect. That is an incredibly ambitious plan. But as a forensic investigator, I have to tell you that you are completely overlooking a massive logistical flaw in your new timeline. The federal authorities are already actively monitoring the offshore wire transfers I initiated exactly 30 minutes ago. You absolutely cannot simply explain away a massive international digital corporate robbery as a random, violent, physical home invasion. Derek paused, his arrogant smile faltering for just a fraction of a second. The cold steel barrel of his gun dropped slightly toward the floor. I immediately aggressively pressed my psychological advantage, leaning forward as much as the heavy plastic ties would physically allow. Your father, Richard, is a highly ruthless, aggressive billionaire. I continued keeping my tone completely conversational and entirely unbothered by the deadly weapon pointing at my chest. When the federal agents knock on his massive front door tomorrow morning and show him the exact routing numbers proving you aggressively embezzled tens of millions from his primary corporate syndicates, do you truly, honestly believe he will protect you? Do you actually think he will quietly accept your fabricated story about a random home intruder when the digital IP evidence perfectly points directly back to your own highly secure basement server rack? I watched his dark eyes rapidly dart back and forth in the stark white light of the tactical flashlight. His massive, fragile ego was completely violently warring with his deep, ingrained terror of his powerful, domineering father. He hated Richard deeply, but he absolutely desperately needed his father's ultimate approval and protection to maintain his wealthy lifestyle. "I do not need my father's pathetic protection," Derek snapped aggressively, raising the heavy firearm again. "I am entirely smarter than him. I built my own massive financial empire right under his arrogant nose, and he absolutely never even noticed a single thing for 2 whole years." I kept pushing, meticulously feeding his desperate, intense need to brag about his own criminal brilliance. "But how exactly did you hide it from his massive internal accounting firm?" I asked, feigning a profound professional curiosity. "I analyzed your entire Black Ledger tonight. Your internal corporate shell companies are structured with an incredibly high level of sophisticated financial layering. It takes absolute genius to completely bypass those massive institutional audits for 2 entire years without triggering a single internal red flag. Even my own federal agency would heavily struggle to build a money laundering network that complex and completely invisible." Derek swallowed the psychological bait, completely entirely hooked by my calculated professional validation. He took a heavy step closer, completely eager to explain his brilliant criminal mechanics to a captive audience who finally truly understood his massive intellect. His own father never appreciated him, but here was a senior federal forensic investigator actively calling him a brilliant genius. His chest puffed out proudly under his ruined, expensive, tailored shirt. It was incredibly easy, he boasted, his voice dripping with absolute monumental arrogance. "My father's massive accounting firm is entirely run by lazy, complacent old men who only look at the primary surface ledgers. I created a completely automated, recursive digital loop using Marcus commercial vendor accounts. I fed the stolen capital directly through my weak, pathetic brother's company, coding it purely as standard architectural consulting fees. I generated thousands of completely fake digital invoices for massive suburban development projects that absolutely never existed in reality. Marcus is so desperately eager to please the family, he never once bothered to actually double-check the dense financial statements I forcefully shoved directly in front of his face to sign. I actively used my own brother's blind, pathetic loyalty to completely wash my money completely clean." He laughed, a dark, cruel sound that echoed terrifyingly in the suffocating, locked room. "And the absolute best part is if the federal authorities ever do manage to crack the outer security shell, the entire fraudulent legal paper trail leads directly straight to Marcus. He takes the massive, devastating federal fall and goes to prison while I walk away completely untouched and completely rich." I kept my face entirely neutral, masking the profound, intense satisfaction blooming directly in my chest. He was actively freely confessing his entire complex money laundering operation entirely out loud, including exactly how he framed his own innocent brother. I was mentally recording every single spoken detail, knowing Jamila would use this exact specific information to completely legally obliterate him in a federal courtroom. "You used your own brother as a massive financial human shield," I stated calmly, projecting a fake sense of profound professional awe. "That requires a completely sociopathic level of intense emotional detachment, Derek. Most amateur criminals absolutely panic when they involve their own direct blood relatives, but you built a perfect, completely insulated failsafe." Derek nodded eagerly, his dark eyes shining with completely deranged pride. "Exactly," he whispered, leaning in so closely I could see the tiny broken blood vessels in his eyes. "I do not possess those weak, pathetic emotional attachments, Harper. Family is just a massive, convenient tool to be entirely used. My wife was a simple tool to acquire inherited assets and secure massive life insurance policies. My brother is a simple tool to completely absorb my corporate legal liabilities. And you?" he said, tracing the cold, heavy steel barrel of the gun slowly down the side of my face. "You are just a massive, convenient tool I am going to use right now to perfectly explain away a tragic, fatal shooting in my master bedroom. You thought you were so incredibly smart coming here tonight to save your pathetic, identical twin. But all you actually did was perfectly deliver yourself right into my absolute control." I stared directly down the dark, hollow barrel of the loaded weapon. My wrists were entirely numb from the tight, biting plastic restraints, and my torn shoulder violently throbbed with every single beat of my racing heart. Derek was completely preparing to pull the trigger. He had fully convinced himself his massive, improvised murderous plan was entirely flawless and completely legally airtight. He raised the heavy gun, aiming it directly perfectly between my eyes, his fingers slowly, confidently tightening around the cold metal trigger. I took one final deep breath in the pitch-black, suffocating room, entirely praying that Jamila's brilliant legal mind and her remote administrative access to Marcus' corporate network were exactly as powerful as she had promised. I desperately needed the massive outside distraction right now. I stared directly down the dark, hollow barrel of the loaded weapon. Derek was completely preparing to pull the trigger. He had fully convinced himself his massive, improvised, murderous plan was entirely flawless and completely legally airtight. He raised the heavy gun, aiming it directly perfectly between my eyes, his fingers slowly, confidently tightening around the cold metal trigger. I took one final deep breath in the pitch-black, suffocating room, entirely praying that Jamila's brilliant legal mind and her remote administrative access to Marcus' corporate network were exactly as powerful as she had promised. I desperately needed the massive outside distraction right now. What Derek absolutely did not know was that exactly 2 blocks away, parked quietly under the heavy canopy of an old oak tree, Jamila was sitting inside her sleek black sedan. She had watched his luxury sports car tear violently down the wet suburban street and violently skid into the driveway. She saw the heavy steel security shutters aggressively slam down over the massive bay windows, completely sealing the house in an impenetrable lockdown. She knew instantly that I was entirely trapped inside with a highly motivated, wealthy predator. But Jamila was not just a sharp corporate attorney. She was the brilliant legal architect of her husband's entire business infrastructure. Because Derek arrogantly used Marcus' commercial vendor accounts to actively launder his stolen millions, he had carelessly integrated his own private smart home security grid directly into Marcus' corporate server network to ensure he always had seamless remote access to the fraudulent financial data. It was a massive, catastrophic security flaw, born entirely out of his own monumental laziness and extreme arrogance. Sitting in the driver's seat of her idling car, Jamila opened her encrypted, secure tablet and logged directly into her husband's master administrative portal. She did not need to actively hack Derek's highly secure biometric firewall, because she was already legally inside his network through the massive digital backdoor he had foolishly left wide open. With a few rapid, aggressive keystrokes, her brilliant mind rapidly dismantled his entire residential security protocol. She completely revoked his master administrator privileges, entirely locking him out of his own multi-million-dollar digital fortress. And then she actively triggered the absolute maximum catastrophic emergency override. Inside the dark, suffocating master bedroom, Derek's heavy finger applied the final lethal pound of physical pressure against the cold steel trigger. But before the heavy internal firing pin could drop, the entire sprawling multi-million-dollar estate violently erupted into absolute chaotic, deafening madness. The state-of-the-art commercial-grade security alarms aggressively triggered at their absolute maximum decibel level. The horrifying, high-pitched, shrieking sirens echoed violently through the dark hallways, physically vibrating the solid hardwood floors beneath my bare feet. At that exact same, terrifying fraction of a second, the heavy, impenetrable steel security shutters covering the massive bay windows violently, instantly retracted. They shot upward into their hidden ceiling compartments with a deafening mechanical crash. The sudden, aggressive influx of the bright gray, rainy Seattle daylight violently flooded the pitch-black bedroom, completely blinding Derek. The massive smart home audio speakers embedded deeply in the ceiling aggressively blasted the automated emergency evacuation warning, repeating the terrifying robotic voice over and over again. Warning. Catastrophic network breach detected. Immediate evacuation required. Law enforcement dispatched. The sudden explosive sensory overload was completely staggering. Derek violently flinched, his dark eyes squeezing tightly shut against the sudden, blinding gray light. His entire towering body instinctively jerked backward in pure, terrified shock. The heavy cold steel barrel of the registered firearm wavered violently away from my face, pointing aimlessly toward the ceiling for exactly one single critical second. That one single solitary second was absolutely everything I needed to completely turn the tide of the violent war. While Derek had been arrogantly mocking me and aggressively outlining his completely psychotic murder plan in the dark, I had not just been passively sitting there waiting to die. I had been silently, rigorously working my heavily restrained fingers against the back of the solid wood armchair. Buried deep inside my messy blonde bob was a thick, heavy-grade industrial metal hairpin I always wore to keep my hair securely pinned back during intense physical Krav Maga sparring sessions. With agonizing slow precision, I had managed to successfully wiggle the sharp metal pin completely out of my hair using only the incredibly numb tips of my constrained fingers. I aggressively wedged the sharp, rigid metal edge directly into the tiny square locking mechanism of the thick, heavy plastic zip tie binding my wrists together. The intense physical pain of the plastic aggressively biting into my raw, bleeding skin was absolutely excruciating, but I forced myself to entirely ignore it. The exact moment the deafening sirens violently erupted and Derek completely lost his visual focus, I violently, aggressively twisted the metal hairpin with every single ounce of physical strength left in my entire body. The internal plastic locking teeth violently snapped with a loud, sharp crack that was completely drowned out by the shrieking house alarms. The heavy, restrictive plastic band violently broke completely open, instantly, freeing my hands. A massive, agonizing wave of white-hot pain violently shot directly up both of my arms as the trapped, heavy blood rapidly, aggressively rushed back into my completely numb fingers. I absolutely did not have the luxury of time to recover. I aggressively reached down and violently snapped the secondary plastic restraints entirely off my bare ankles using the same heavy metal hairpin. I was completely, entirely, physically free. Derek rapidly blinked his dark eyes, desperately trying to regain his visual focus in the suddenly bright, chaotic bedroom. He aggressively lowered the heavy firearm, preparing to quickly aim it directly back at my chest, but he was entirely too late. I aggressively lunged violently upward from the heavy wooden armchair, completely utilizing the massive explosive element of absolute surprise. I did not try to aggressively wrestle the heavy-loaded gun away from his massive, strong hands. That is a completely fatal mistake made by untrained amateurs. Instead, I violently, aggressively attacked his absolute most vulnerable physiological weak point. I drove the hardened, solid heel of my right palm violently, aggressively upward, directly into the soft, exposed cartilage of his throat, perfectly executing a devastating Krav Maga tracheal strike. The brutal, violent impact was completely sickening. Derek let out a horrific, strangled, violently gagging sound as his entire windpipe instantly completely spasmed. His massive, towering body violently, instinctively folded completely forward as his brain desperately, violently panicked from the sudden, complete lack of oxygen. His large, heavy hands flew aggressively up to his violently bruised throat, completely dropping the heavy, matte black firearm. The loaded, deadly weapon clattered violently against the expensive hardwood floor, entirely useless. I absolutely did not stop my aggressive assault. I grabbed the thick, expensive lapels of his custom-tailored suit jacket, violently pulling his heavy, leaning body forcefully downward. I drove my right knee violently, aggressively upward, directly into his descending face. The brutal, violent impact of my solid kneecap against his nose resulted in a loud, terrifying crunch. Dark red blood instantly, violently exploded across his handsome, arrogant face, completely ruining his pristine, expensive clothing. Derek violently crashed heavily onto the wooden floor, completely incapacitated, aggressively gasping desperately for air, and wildly clutching his shattered, bleeding face. I stood towering completely above him for one brief, deeply satisfying second, watching the absolute wealthy, arrogant monster completely violently reduced to a pathetic, helpless, bleeding mess on his own bedroom floor. I turned completely away from him and sprinted aggressively out of the ruined master bedroom. The massive, sprawling estate was completely violently flashing with bright red emergency strobe lights, and the deafening sirens completely consumed the ambient air. I ran frantically down the long second-floor hallway, my bare feet slapping aggressively against the cold hardwood. I reached the sweeping grand mahogany staircase and violently threw myself completely down the steps, taking them 2 and 3 at a time, entirely ignoring the massive burning pain aggressively throbbing in my torn left shoulder. I reached the massive grand foyer at the absolute bottom of the stairs. The heavy, solid oak front door, which had been aggressively bolted shut by the terrifying smart home lockdown protocol just minutes earlier, was now sitting completely wide open. Jamila had successfully used her remote administrative override to completely unlock every single exterior exit in the entire massive residential fortress. I sprinted aggressively through the grand foyer and burst violently out the front door, completely escaping the deafening, chaotic alarms of the sprawling estate. The freezing heavy Seattle rain violently, instantly hit my face, washing away the sticky sweat and the terrifying, lingering scent of Derek's expensive, stale scotch. I ran frantically down the long, manicured driveway, my bare feet violently splashing through the deep, cold puddles, completely ignoring the sharp, painful rocks aggressively biting into my skin. At the exact absolute end of the long, sweeping driveway, Jamila's sleek black sedan was idling aggressively by the curb. The powerful engine was roaring heavily, and the passenger side door was completely, violently thrown wide open, exactly waiting for me. I dove aggressively entirely into the warm leather passenger seat, violently slamming the heavy car door completely shut behind me. Jamila did not say a single solitary word. She did not ask if I was okay. She aggressively slammed her foot down onto the gas pedal, and the powerful black car violently, completely peeled away from the expensive curb, leaving the screaming, flashing, multi-million-dollar estate completely, entirely in the rearview mirror. We had completely destroyed him. 48 hours had passed since we tore away from the sprawling suburban estate in the freezing Seattle rain. 2 entire days of absolute agonizing silence from Derek. He did not file a police report about the violent altercation in his master bedroom. He did not send his private security team to hunt me down in the city. He did exactly what highly narcissistic cornered predators always do when they suffer a massive, unexpected physical and financial blow. He aggressively compartmentalized the catastrophic damage and desperately retreated into the absolute safety of his public elite facade. It was a Thursday evening, and the grand ballroom of the prestigious Fairmont Olympic Hotel in downtown Seattle was absolutely vibrating with the sickening hum of extreme unearned wealth. Derek was hosting his massive annual corporate charity gala. It was a lavish, highly publicized event designed entirely to wash his dirty public image and stroke his towering, fragile ego. I knew he would absolutely never cancel the gala. His massive narcissistic pride simply would not allow him to show a single ounce of weakness to his ruthless billionaire father or his elite social circle. He truly believed that because I had successfully stolen his hidden offshore millions and violently escaped into the night, I had simply taken the money and permanently gone into hiding. He arrogantly assumed I was absolutely terrified of his massive legal resources and would never dare to publicly show my face in his elite territory ever again. He was standing proudly behind the heavy crystal podium, positioned at the exact center of the lavishly decorated stage. He wore a flawless, custom-tailored black tuxedo that perfectly masked the violent physical trauma I had inflicted upon his towering body just 2 days prior. The brutal, devastating knee strike I had delivered directly to his face had severely fractured his nose and left massive dark purple bruising across his cheekbones. But his expensive private cosmetic team had aggressively worked absolute miracles. They used thick layers of heavy professional theatrical concealer to perfectly mask the dark, violent bruises, and he wore a small flesh-colored medical splint over the bridge of his nose, framing it as a tragic minor accident from a recent aggressive charity squash match. He looked incredibly handsome, incredibly wealthy, and utterly, completely untouchable. The massive ballroom was packed with over 300 of Seattle's absolute wealthiest elites. Corporate executives, aggressive real estate developers, and corrupt local politicians all sipping expensive vintage champagne and completely hanging on to his every single word. Richard and Patricia sat at the absolute center VIP table, right in the front row, glowing with profound, toxic parental pride as their golden son expertly commanded the massive room. Marcus sat quietly beside them, looking entirely exhausted and completely oblivious to the massive federal financial crimes his brother had secretly pinned directly onto his name. But sitting directly next to Marcus, perfectly radiating a cold, absolute lethal calm, was Jamila. She wore a stunning emerald green evening gown, and she was casually sipping her sparkling water. Her sharp, intelligent brown eyes locked perfectly onto the heavy oak entrance doors at the very back of the ballroom. She knew exactly what time it was. Derek leaned confidently into the silver microphone, his deep, smooth voice echoing flawlessly across the massive, silent ballroom. Philanthropy is not just a corporate financial obligation. He lied, his tone dripping with absolute fake sincerity and complete manufactured empathy. It is a profound moral duty. We have been given so much by this beautiful city, and it is our absolute sacred responsibility to give back to those who are struggling in the dark. He paused exactly for the right amount of dramatic effect, perfectly manipulating the emotions of the wealthy, captive audience. Many of you know that my own beautiful wife, Haley, could not be here with us tonight. He continued, his voice dropping into a soft, perfectly manufactured register of tragic, deep sorrow. She is currently fighting a very difficult, highly private battle with her own severe mental health. It has been an incredibly dark and devastating time for our family, but it is exactly her quiet, brave struggle that deeply inspires me to stand up here tonight and continue fighting for those who cannot fight for themselves. The absolute sheer psychopathic audacity of his words was completely physically nauseating. He was actively using the terrified woman he had meticulously violently abused and actively planned to brutally murder as a convenient, tragic prop to completely elevate his own fraudulent public profile. A soft, sympathetic murmur rippled completely through the wealthy crowd. Patricia lightly dabbed at her dry eyes with an expensive lace handkerchief, entirely buying into the completely fabricated tragic narrative of her wealthy, long-suffering son. Derek offered the crowd a brave, highly practiced, sad smile and raised his crystal glass of sparkling water to propose a massive toast. But before the expensive crystal glass could even reach his lying lips, the massive, heavy, solid oak doors at the absolute back of the grand ballroom were violently, aggressively pushed completely open. The heavy wooden doors hit the brass wall, stops with a deafening sharp crack that instantly completely shattered the quiet, sympathetic atmosphere of the lavish room. The soft, elegant string quartet, playing gently in the corner, instantly abruptly stopped playing, entirely shocked by the sudden, aggressive interruption. Every single head in the massive 300-person ballroom violently turned simultaneously directly toward the back entrance. The heavy, suffocating silence that instantly fell over the grand room was absolute and completely terrifying. I stepped directly onto the plush red carpet of the grand ballroom, perfectly illuminated by the massive crystal chandeliers hanging heavily above us. I was no longer wearing the conservative beige cashmere sweaters or the pathetic, submissive posture of my broken, identical sister. I was entirely, completely myself. I wore a razor-sharp, perfectly tailored crimson-red power suit that absolutely demanded complete, undivided attention. My blonde hair was professionally blown out, falling in perfect, thick waves, entirely framing my completely unbruised, flawlessly smooth face. I walked with the absolute, rigid, terrifying confidence of a senior forensic accountant who had just completely successfully dismantled a multi-million-dollar criminal empire and was now arriving perfectly on time to completely collect the remaining debt. My high heels clicked aggressively against the polished marble threshold, echoing violently loudly in the dead, silent room. But the collective, terrified gasp that violently ripped through the wealthy elite crowd was absolutely not directed at me. The loud, profound shock, completely radiating from the 300 wealthy guests, was entirely directed at the woman walking perfectly slowly, directly right beside me. Haley walked into the blinding light of the massive ballroom, holding her head absolutely incredibly high. She did not wear an expensive designer ball gown or heavy theatrical makeup to perfectly hide her profound, traumatic truth. She wore a simple, elegant black dress that perfectly entirely exposed the raw, terrifying physical reality of what Derek had done to her. The massive dark purple and sickly yellow bruise I had carefully painted onto my own face 2 days ago was absolutely real, on hers entirely covering the entire left side of her beautiful face. Her right eye was still severely swollen shut. Her right wrist was heavily securely wrapped in a thick white medical cast, tightly supported by a black medical sling resting against her chest. She looked exactly like a woman who had just barely survived a massive, brutal physical war. But she was no longer shaking. She was no longer cowering in the dark, freezing rain, completely terrified of the wealthy monster who owned her. She was standing absolutely tall, perfectly supported by my physical presence, entirely reclaiming her absolute stolen power in front of the entire elite city. The psychological impact of our identical faces appearing entirely simultaneously was completely devastating. The wealthy elite crowd completely, violently, instantly understood the massive, terrifying physical contrast perfectly presented right in front of them. One twin absolutely flawless and radiating pure lethal power. The other twin physically violently broken but entirely, undeniably, bravely alive. A loud, chaotic wave of frantic, aggressive whispering violently, instantly erupted across the massive room. People aggressively pointed their heavy, diamond-ringed fingers, completely dropping their expensive crystal champagne flutes onto the carpeted floor in absolute sheer disbelief. Patricia let out a loud, sharp, horrified shriek, violently dropping her lace handkerchief entirely onto the floor. Richard stood aggressively, violently up from his front row VIP table, his heavy chair crashing completely backward, his dark, cold eyes rapidly darting back and forth between my perfectly unblemished face and Haley's severely brutalized body. Jamila remained perfectly entirely seated, calmly setting her sparkling water perfectly down onto the white linen tablecloth, a slow, highly satisfied, cold smile perfectly spreading across her beautiful face. At the absolute center of the grand stage, Derek completely, entirely froze. The heavy crystal glass of sparkling water violently, aggressively slipped right through his trembling fingers, completely crashing onto the polished wooden stage and violently shattering into 1,000 tiny sharp pieces. The loud, sharp sound of the breaking glass was completely amplified by the highly sensitive silver microphone perfectly broadcasting his absolute terrifying panic directly to the entire room. All the expensive theatrical makeup and the tailored black tuxedo could absolutely not hide the profound, catastrophic terror that violently, completely washed over his handsome, arrogant face. His perfectly constructed, wealthy, philanthropic reality instantly, violently, completely collapsed right in front of his very eyes. He had arrogantly, completely convinced himself that I was hiding in the dark, terrified shadows. He completely believed his massive, wealthy reputation made him absolutely, entirely untouchable. He absolutely never in a million years anticipated that I would aggressively drag his darkest, most violent secrets directly into the blinding bright light of his most important public triumph. I stopped walking exactly in the absolute center of the grand ballroom, keeping Haley perfectly securely by my side. I looked directly up at the grand stage, completely locking my cold, unforgiving hazel eyes directly perfectly onto Derek's terrified, rapidly paling face. The absolute final public execution of his entire arrogant life was absolutely perfectly ready to completely begin. The heavy silence in the grand ballroom was absolute. 300 of the wealthiest and most influential people in Seattle sat frozen in their plush chairs, paralyzed by the stark physical contrast, standing right in front of the heavy oak doors. I stood still, my hazel eyes locked onto Derek's paling face. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost rise from the dead. His towering frame went rigid, his custom-tailored tuxedo suddenly looking like a restrictive costume. The heavy crystal glass he had just dropped lay shattered in 1,000 tiny pieces across the polished wooden stage, mirroring the catastrophic destruction of his fabricated public reality. He opened his mouth to demand that security remove us from the room, but no sound came out. His throat was entirely constricted by overwhelming terror. He was trapped on a highly illuminated public stage with nowhere left to hide. Down in the front row, sitting comfortably at the center VIP table, Jamila slowly crossed her elegant legs. She was not looking at the dramatic spectacle unfolding at the back of the room. She was looking directly at the arrogant monster standing frozen on the stage. She reached into her designer evening clutch and smoothly pulled out a sleek silver digital tablet. Because Derek was a massive narcissist who demanded total control over every aspect of his charity gala, he had insisted that the hotel audiovisual system be wirelessly linked directly to his primary corporate network. He wanted to seamlessly control the presentation slides from his own phone. But Jamila was the legally authorized architect of that exact network. She had spent the last 48 hours meticulously compiling every piece of devastating digital evidence I had extracted from his basement server. She formatted the financial data and the horrifying legal documents into an inescapable digital presentation. Jamila slowly raised her sharp, dark eyes, meeting Derek's panicked gaze. She offered him a cold, lethal smile, and then, with one manicured finger, she tapped the execution command on her tablet. Behind Derek, the floor-to-ceiling high-definition projection screen, which had been proudly displaying his charitable donation metrics, abruptly went pitch black. A sharp digital static feedback screeched through the towering ballroom speakers, startling the wealthy guests in their seats. Derek spun around his dark eyes, widening in sheer horror, as the screen flashed brilliantly back to life. But it was no longer showing the smiling faces of the underprivileged children he claimed to support. The screen was filled with the crisp, highly detailed digital scans of his private black leather ledger. The complex alphanumeric routing numbers and staggering multi-million-dollar offshore banking balances were projected in massive bright white letters for the entire city to see. The undeniable proof of his financial crimes was laid bare. The educated crowd instantly recognized what they were looking at. A chaotic wave of confused whispering erupted across the grand ballroom. At the center VIP table, Richard's aged face drained of all color. The ruthless billionaire leaned forward, his cold eyes rapidly scanning the projected financial documents. He instantly recognized the legal names of his own primary corporate syndicates, listed right alongside the 8-figure unauthorized offshore wire transfers. The profound realization that his golden favorite son had been systematically robbing him blind hit the old man with the devastating force of a speeding truck. Richard slammed his wrinkled fist down onto the white linen tablecloth, toppling his crystal champagne flute. "What the hell is this, Derek?" "The billionaire," roared his deep voice, cutting through the chaotic murmurs of the room. Derek stumbled backward, stepping away from the silver microphone. His hands were shaking uncontrollably. He frantically reached into his tailored tuxedo pocket, pulling out his phone, desperately trying to override the digital projection. "Turn it off!" he screamed, his voice cracking with unfiltered panic. "Somebody shut the power off right now." But the hotel technicians were locked out of the encrypted feed. Jamila held absolute digital control. She calmly swiped her finger across her silver tablet, advancing the presentation to the next slide. The offshore ledgers vanished from the giant screen, instantly replaced by the detailed legal pages of the fraudulent life insurance policies. The red accordion file I had scanned in his dark office was now displayed for the world to judge. The name Haley Marie Carver was prominently printed in bold ink, right next to the $12 million guaranteed payout figure. The dates aligned perfectly with the sudden escalation of his domestic abuse. The elite crowd, which had been loudly whispering about corporate fraud, suddenly went dead silent. The terrifying reality of the projected documents washed over the room. They were no longer just looking at a white-collar criminal. They were looking at a cold-blooded, calculating sociopathic murderer who had meticulously planned to end the life of his innocent wife for untraceable financial gain. Patricia covered her mouth with her trembling hands, letting out a sharp, terrified sob. She turned her head away from the stage, unable to bear the truth about the monster she had raised. The sheer disgust radiating from the 300 guests was palpable. They saw him now. The handsome philanthropic facade was burned to the ground, leaving only the rotting core exposed. Derek backed away toward the heavy velvet curtains at the rear edge of the stage, searching for an escape route. His chest was heaving, and thick beads of cold sweat ran down his bruised face. But Jamila was not finished. She had one final blow prepared. She tapped her tablet one last time. The projection screen shifted from static documents into high-definition video. It was the encrypted smart home security camera footage extracted from the center of his open-concept kitchen. The video clearly showed Derek grabbing my wrist and pinning me down onto the hard ceramic floor. Because the smart home cameras recorded high-quality audio, the deafening ballroom speakers broadcasted his cruel threats directly to the captive crowd. "You think you are strong now," his digitized voice boomed through the silent room. "You are nothing without me and my money. You have until my family dinner tomorrow night to sign those property deeds, or I will have you committed to a psychiatric ward on an involuntary hold for violent hysteria." The horrifying audio confirmed every detail of the calculated abuse. The crowd erupted into absolute chaos. Wealthy women were screaming in terror. Powerful corporate men stood up shouting at the stage, demanding immediate answers. The public execution was flawless. I stood securely at the back of the lavish ballroom, keeping my hand tightly wrapped around Haley's good shoulder. She was quietly crying, but they were no longer tears of fear. They were tears of final liberation. She was completely free. On the grand stage, Derek finally snapped. His massive, fragile ego shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. He abandoned any remaining shred of dignity and bolted toward the side stage exit. He shoved a terrified young catering waiter out of his desperate path, frantically running toward the heavy doors that led to the hotel service elevators. He truly believed he could simply run away from the destruction of his life. But as his heavy leather shoes pounded across the polished wooden stage, the solid side doors burst wide open. A tactical squad of highly trained federal agents, wearing dark body armor and bright yellow FBI windbreakers, swarmed onto the stage. They had been tipped off 36 hours ago by my secure forensic audit and Jamila's airtight legal filing. They were patiently waiting exactly outside the ballroom, ready to strike. Derek skidded to a terrified halt, his dark eyes widening in sheer terror. An incredibly tall, heavily built federal agent tackled Derek directly down onto the hard wooden stage. The brutal physical impact echoed through the chaotic ballroom. Derek's expensive tuxedo jacket ripped open as the agents pinned his arms behind his back. The sharp, distinct metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs snapping tightly around his wrists was the single most beautiful, satisfying sound I had ever heard in my entire life. "Get off me, you pathetic idiots!" Derek roared, frantically thrashing his body against the floor. "Do you have any idea who my powerful father is? Do you know who I am?" But no one in the elite crowd moved a single inch to help him. They all just stood, frozen in terror and disgust. In exactly 60 short seconds, the golden, untouchable real estate king of Seattle had lost his massive fortune, his flawless public reputation, and his total freedom forever. The armed federal agents hauled his defeated, bleeding body to his feet. They dragged him off the grand stage and out the side exit doors, leaving behind a stunned, silent room. At the front, VIP table, Richard stood frozen, staring at the empty stage where his golden son had just been arrested. He turned directly toward his older son, Marcus. "You have to do something," Marcus, Richard demanded, his old voice trembling with blind rage. "You have to call the corporate lawyers right now." But Marcus slowly stood up from his heavy chair. He looked at his father, and then he looked directly at his brilliant, beautiful wife, Jamila. Marcus reached out and gently took Jamila's hand into his own. "No, Dad," Marcus said, his voice steady and resolute for the first time in his life. "I am done protecting this toxic family." Marcus turned his back on his father's massive empire and slowly walked out of the ballroom, standing securely right next to the brilliant woman who had saved his life. We had won. 6 months have passed since that explosive, unforgettable night at the grand downtown ballroom. The harsh, freezing rain of the Seattle winter has completely surrendered to the warm, golden light of a beautiful late summer afternoon. I am currently sitting on the weathered wooden porch of our grandmother's historic lakefront cabin. It is the very same secluded property Derek had violently tried to steal from us. Today, the legal deed is securely locked away entirely in my sister's name, perfectly protected by an impenetrable ironclad legal trust that Jamila personally drafted for her. The gentle, soothing sound of the calm lake water lapping against the old wooden dock fills the quiet, peaceful air, perfectly replacing the terrifying, deafening sirens and the aggressive shouting that once haunted our darkest nightmares. Beside me, sitting comfortably in a soft woven wicker chair, is Haley. The dark, ugly purple and yellow bruises that once violently covered her beautiful face have completely faded away, leaving behind nothing but her radiant, glowing, natural skin. The heavy, restrictive white medical cast is entirely gone from her right wrist, replaced now by a delicate, shining silver bracelet she proudly bought for herself to officially celebrate her brand new, independent life. She is holding a warm mug of chamomile tea and looking out at the bright blue water. For the first time in 5 agonizing, terrifying years, she is genuinely smiling. It is not the fragile, forced, terrified smile she used to constantly offer Derek, just to desperately keep the unpredictable peace in that dark, suffocating smart house. It is a deep, bright, beautiful, authentic smile that reaches all the way up to her bright hazel eyes. She is finally completely and undeniably free. The heavy, suffocating dark cloud of profound psychological trauma is slowly lifting. She is actively attending intensive trauma therapy every single week, and she is slowly, beautifully rediscovering exactly who she used to be before that wealthy, arrogant monster aggressively tried to erase her entire existence. She sleeps soundly through the night now, without waking up in a blind, terrifying panic. She chooses her own comfortable clothes, she eats whatever she wants, and she laughs with a bright, ringing joy that perfectly heals my own battered soul. The massive legal and social fallout from the charity gala was swift, absolute, and completely devastating. Derek is currently sitting in a cold, sterile, maximum security federal penitentiary, entirely awaiting a massive, complex trial for high-level corporate embezzlement, massive wire fraud, and premeditated attempted murder. His towering, fragile ego was completely, violently crushed under the immense, undeniable weight of the irrefutable digital financial evidence we perfectly handed directly to the federal prosecutors. The arrogant, powerful man who once aggressively commanded entire boardrooms and ruthlessly controlled his terrified wife through physical violence is now completely powerless. His powerful billionaire father, Richard, entirely publicly disowned him, aggressively, violently cutting him completely out of the massive family trust to desperately protect his own corporate syndicates from the massive, catastrophic federal fallout. Derek lost his sprawling, multi-million-dollar estate, his expensive fleet of luxury sports cars, his pristine social reputation, and his absolute total freedom in the blink of an eye. Meanwhile, Marcus and Jamila successfully, brilliantly navigated the terrifying legal storm. Jamila expertly proved her husband's complete, absolute innocence to the federal investigators, and Marcus finally found the absolute necessary courage to permanently break away from his toxic father's suffocating, corrupt empire. He officially started his own independent architectural firm, and he and Jamila are thriving completely free from the heavy, dark shadow of Derek's massive criminal greed. The stolen millions I aggressively routed into the blind legal escrow account were successfully entirely seized by the federal authorities and meticulously legally returned to the rightful corporate investors, entirely closing the dark, terrifying chapter of Derek's arrogant criminal reign. Sitting here on this quiet, peaceful, sunlit porch, watching the gentle ripples of the clear lake water, I find myself deeply, profoundly reflecting on the terrifying true nature of the human monsters who walk freely among us, wearing expensive, tailored suits and flashing, charming, calculated smiles. Predators exactly like Derek do not ever succeed because they are untouchable, brilliant criminal geniuses. They absolutely, aggressively thrive in the dark, suffocating, terrifying silence. They intentionally weaponize extreme isolation. They meticulously and slowly, violently cut their innocent victims off from their loving friends, their supportive, fiercely loyal families, and their own internal, deep sense of basic human self-worth. They aggressively operate in the terrifying shadows until the victim truly, completely believes they are entirely alone in a dark, dangerous, unforgiving world. Derek arrogantly thought he had successfully built a perfect, impenetrable steel fortress of fear entirely around my sister. He confidently assumed that because she was physically smaller and emotionally entirely exhausted, she was completely, utterly defenseless. He believed his massive wealth and his towering physical presence made him the absolute, undisputed king of his dark, twisted castle. But he made the ultimate, fatal, catastrophic mistake of completely, entirely underestimating the profound, unbreakable, fierce strength of our shared bloodline. He completely forgot that when you aggressively, violently back a woman into a dark, terrifying corner and actively threaten the lives of the people she fiercely loves, you do not just get a broken, frightened victim. You get a highly trained, lethal warrior, absolutely, entirely willing to burn your entire corrupt world completely to the ground to protect her family. You get a seasoned forensic accountant who will aggressively, meticulously dismantle your entire financial empire stroke by keystroke until you have absolutely nothing left to hide behind. I learned that sometimes protecting your blood means becoming the very monster their abusers fear. Never let anyone convince you that you are trapped. If you or someone you know has ever had to fight back against a toxic situation, hit the like button and subscribe. Tell me in the comments, what is the bravest thing you have ever done to protect someone you love? Drop your city and time below, and I will see you in the next story.